Before we begin tonight, a quick word of gratitude. This episode exists because of Robert. Thank you, Robert, for sending in this topic. And if anyone else out there has a theory, a story, a corner of history they think deserves the spotlight, drop it in the comments. One more thing before we dive in. If you are listening on Spotify, please take 10 seconds, just 10, and leave us a review. It costs you nothing, it means everything, and it is the single most powerful way you can help this channel grow. Now, let's begin. March 11th, 2011, Fukushima, Japan. At 14:46 on a Tuesday afternoon, the ground beneath the northeastern coast of Japan begins to shake in a way that humans have no language for. The Tohoku earthquake, measuring 9.0 on the moment magnitude scale, lasts approximately 6 minutes. 6 minutes. In geological terms, that is an eternity of violence. The ocean floor displaces, a wall of water begins its westward journey towards shore, and at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant something begins to fail that was never supposed to fail. Within hours of the tsunami striking the facility, the cooling systems at 3 of the plant's reactors lose power. The fuel rods begin to overheat, and then, in sequence, Reactor 1, Reactor 3, Reactor 2, the containment structures begin to suffer hydrogen explosions. The world watches. It watches on television, on early smartphones, on laptop screens in offices and living rooms and coffee shops. Radiation detectors in Russia begin to spike. Sensors in California register atmospheric changes. Governments across the Pacific issue potassium iodide advisories. Ocean monitoring buoys transmit anomalous readings. Satellites adjust their orbital passes to capture spectral data above the Japanese coastline. There is nowhere to hide a nuclear event in the modern world. The infrastructure of global scientific observation is too dense, too interconnected, too automated. The moment something goes wrong with a nuclear facility, the world knows within hours. That is the world we live in now. But this was not always the world we lived in. Decades before Fukushima, decades before the age of interconnected sensors and satellite grids and open-source radiation monitoring, in a place so remote that only a few hundred people on the entire planet were positioned to notice anything at all, something may have happened. Something that did not appear on any global alert system. Something that generated no international headlines, no diplomatic communiques, no emergency broadcasts. Something that, if the theory holds, looked like nothing at all. Tonight, we go to the bottom of the world. Part 1. 1962. The first reactor at the end of the Earth. To understand what may have happened in Antarctica, you first need to understand why nuclear energy was ever brought there in the first place. And to understand that, you need to understand the Cold War, not as a political abstraction, but as a technological arms race in which no environment on Earth was considered too extreme, too hostile, or too impractical to serve as a laboratory. In the early 1960s, the United States military was deeply invested in the concept of portable nuclear power. The idea was elegant in its ambition. If a reactor could be engineered to function in remote, logistically isolated environments, it could free military installations from the supply chains that conventional fuel required. No fuel convoys, no vulnerability to interdiction, just a compact, self-sustaining power source that could run for years in the most unforgiving places on the planet. Antarctica was, in many ways, the ultimate test case. In 1962, the United States Army installed a small nuclear reactor at McMurdo Station. The American research base situated on the southern tip of Ross Island, looking out over McMurdo Sound and beyond. That, the vast white silence of the Antarctic continent. The reactor was designated PM-3A, part of the Army nuclear power program. It was designed to provide electrical power to the station, reduce the enormous logistical burden of transporting diesel fuel to one of the most inaccessible places on Earth, and, perhaps most importantly, to test whether nuclear infrastructure could function reliably in extreme polar conditions. On paper, PM-3A was a success story of American engineering ingenuity. In practice, the picture was considerably more complicated. internal engineering record, partial declassification. Throughout its operational period, maintenance reports filed by personnel at McMurdo Station documented a pattern of persistent and troubling anomalies. Microfractures were observed in certain reactor components. Concerns were raised about radiation leakage at levels that required careful management. Contamination was significant enough to necessitate the removal of large volumes of soil and ice from the immediate area surrounding the reactor site. The official explanation for these issues was measured and clinical. Routine operational challenges in extreme conditions. Antarctica, after all, is not a forgiving environment. Materials behave differently at temperatures that regularly plunge to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Metal contracts. Seals fail. Maintenance becomes exponentially more difficult when your technicians are working in thick gloves with limited daylight and equipment that was never designed to function below freezing. All of that is true. All of that is documented and verifiable. But buried within the internal engineering notes from the same period is a phrase that has never been fully explained. A phrase that, when you read it in context, feels distinctly out of place among the dry procedural language that surrounds it. Unpredictable containment behaviour under polar electromagnetic conditions. Unpredictable, not challenging. Not difficult, unpredictable. That is a word that carries significant weight in the language of nuclear engineering, and the phrase that follows it, polar electromagnetic conditions, opens a door that the official record never quite closes again. Antarctica is not a normal place in terms of electromagnetic and geophysical activity. The continent sits astride the southern magnetic pole. The ionosphere above it behaves differently than it does at lower latitudes. The auroral zone, the region where charged particles from the sun interact with Earth's magnetic field to produce the aurora australis, creates an environment of fluctuating electromagnetic phenomena, unlike anything that exists in the temperate or tropical zones where most nuclear infrastructure had been tested and refined. If a nuclear reactor behaved unpredictably in that environment, the engineers at McMurdo would have had very good reason to ask why, and they would have had very good reason to want to study the phenomenon more carefully. Official records state that PM3A operated until 1972, when it was shut down and removed due to reliability issues. No major accident was reported. The site was remediated. The reactor components were shipped back to the United States. The experiment, at least officially, was concluded. But here is where the thread begins to pull. Part 2. Late 1960s, the silent expansion. To understand the next layer of this theory, you need to place it in the context of what was happening in nuclear science more broadly during the late 1960s. Because something remarkable was being discovered during this period, something that fundamentally changed how scientists and military planners understood the behaviour of nuclear energy. Operation Fishbowl. If you have heard of it, you know how extraordinary it was. If you have not, prepare yourself. Between April and November of 1962, the same year that PM3A was being installed at McMurdo, the United States conducted a series of high-altitude nuclear tests over the Pacific Ocean in a program collectively known as Operation Fishbowl. The most famous of these tests was Starfish Prime, detonated at an altitude of approximately 400 kilometres above Johnston Atoll on July 9th, 1962. The warhead yield was 1.4 megatons. What happened next was not what anyone fully anticipated. The electromagnetic pulse from the detonation disrupted electrical systems in Hawaii, nearly 1,400 kilometres away. Streetlights failed, circuit breakers tripped. The ionosphere was dramatically altered in ways that persisted for weeks. And perhaps most significantly, the detonation created an artificial radiation belt around the Earth, a ring of high-energy electrons trapped in the planet's magnetic field that lasted for months and damaged or destroyed several early satellites. The lesson was clear and startling. Nuclear energy does not behave the same way in every environment. The electromagnetic and geophysical context matters enormously. Outside the atmosphere, in the presence of Earth's magnetic field at altitude, nuclear detonations produce effects that ground-level testing could never have predicted. This discovery sent a ripple through the scientific and military establishments that is difficult to overstate. Consider the position of the scientists and military planners who processed those results in the months and years after Starfish Prime. They had believed they understood nuclear detonations. They had conducted hundreds of tests. They had built elaborate theoretical models. They had accumulated decades of observational data from tests conducted in the Pacific and in Nevada, and in the atmosphere above the Marshall Islands. And then they had detonated a single weapon at altitude, and discovered that their models had failed to predict some of the most significant effects of the event: an artificial radiation belt that persisted for months, satellite damage that occurred at distances far greater than any model had suggested, electromagnetic effects in Hawaii that no one had anticipated. If the models were wrong about altitude, where else might they be wrong? What other environments had not been tested? What other geophysical contexts might produce effects that the existing theoretical framework could not anticipate? These were not idle academic questions. They were urgent strategic questions. The Cold War was, at its core, a competition between two superpowers who were each trying to understand nuclear weapons more deeply and more completely than the other. Any environment that might produce unexpected effects that could be weaponized, or that might render existing weapons less effective, or that might suggest new approaches to energy release and containment, was an environment that demanded study. The polar regions were, in this context, a glaring gap in the experimental record. Nuclear weapons had been tested in the tropics, in the American West, in the Soviet steppes, at high altitude over the Pacific. But the polar electromagnetic environment, the region directly above and adjacent to the magnetic poles, where the dynamics of Earth's magnetic field are at their most extreme and their most complex, had never been the subject of a systematic nuclear study at the surface level. Operation Dominic, conducted in 1962, included tests over Johnston Atoll in the Pacific. Project Orion studied nuclear propulsion in the context of space. The Plowshare program studied nuclear excavation. Each of these programs was exploring a different aspect of nuclear behaviour in a different environmental context. The logic of the era was to systematically map the behaviour of nuclear energy across as many different environments as possible. To leave a major geophysical environment unstudied was, within the framework of that logic, not a limitation but a priority, a gap that needed to be filled. And there was one more factor that made Antarctica specifically compelling, beyond its electromagnetic and geophysical characteristics. That factor was the ice itself. The Antarctic ice sheet is not simply frozen water. It is a geological archive of extraordinary depth and complexity. The ice cores drilled from the Antarctic plateau have yielded records of atmospheric composition, temperature and volcanic activity stretching back nearly 1 million years. The ice sheet contains within its layers a physical history of the planet's climate, a record encoded in isotopes, in trapped air bubbles, in microscopic particles that fell from the atmosphere across geological time. It is, in a very real sense, a library written in frozen water and ancient air. But the ice is also a medium. It conducts sound, it transmits seismic energy, it interacts with radar in ways that allow scientists to map the terrain beneath it in extraordinary detail. And its relationship to electromagnetic energy, to radio waves, to the charged particles of the aurora, to the complex interplay of the polar magnetic environment, is something that was, in the 1960s, still only partially understood. If you were a scientist trying to understand how nuclear energy interacted with extreme electromagnetic environments, and you were constrained to work in a place that was isolated, accessible only to cleared personnel, and geophysically unlike anywhere else on Earth, Antarctica was not merely convenient. It was, in the logic of the Cold War scientific establishment, close to ideal. What other geophysical contexts had not yet been tested? What happened when nuclear energy encountered extreme cold, extreme pressure, extreme magnetic activity, extreme geological formations? Antarctica, as it turns out, offered a uniquely compelling answer to every one of those questions. The continent is isolated from the rest of the world's land masses, surrounded by the most turbulent ocean on Earth. Its population at any given time is measured in hundreds rather than millions. It sits directly beneath the southern auroral zone, where Earth's magnetic field lines converge and the electromagnetic environment is perpetually active. Beneath its surface lies some of the most ancient and geologically complex rock on the planet, overlaid by ice sheets that in places reach nearly 5 kilometres in depth. The pressure at the base of those ice sheets is extraordinary. The temperatures are extreme. The geophysical conditions are, in every measurable sense, unlike anywhere else on Earth. Some conspiracy theorists argue that by the mid-1960s, this combination of factors had made Antarctica uniquely valuable to a very specific kind of scientific inquiry, one that could not be conducted anywhere with significant civilian populations, one that required the kind of isolation that could guarantee operational security, and one that the Antarctic Treaty of 1959 had not yet been thoroughly equipped to prohibit or monitor. According to the theory, a second experimental site was established during this period, not at McMurdo, not officially recorded in any declassified document. A site positioned deep within the Antarctic ice sheet, accessible only to a small number of cleared personnel, operating under classification levels that would not be visible to most of the scientists and support staff working at the official research stations. Its purpose, according to those who have pieced together fragments of the theory from partial documents, declassified Cold War archives, and the accounts of former personnel who spoke in later years with varying degrees of specificity, was to study something very particular, something that the fishbowl tests had raised as an urgent question and left unanswered. How does sustained nuclear energy interact with Earth's magnetic field at the pole itself? What happens when you push that interaction not upward, into the stratosphere, but downward, into the ice, into the rock, into the ancient geological structures that lie beneath Antarctica's frozen surface? No one in the official record appears to have answered that question directly, but according to the Icefall Protocol theory, someone tried. Part 3. Winter 1968. The event. The theory places the critical event in the winter of 1968, Antarctic winter, which means that the sun has not risen above the horizon in weeks. The darkness is absolute. The temperature at the ice shelf is so far below zero that exposed skin freezes in minutes. The wind off the polar plateau carries ice crystals sharp enough to etch glass. It is, by any reasonable definition, the last place on Earth where you would want to be conducting a large-scale experiment with unpredictable parameters. And yet, according to the theory, a classified experiment was conducted at the undisclosed Antarctic site during this period. The objective was not a weapons test in the conventional sense. There was no bomb. There was no warhead. What was being tested, according to the theory, was something more technically subtle, and in some ways more scientifically ambitious. A modified nuclear system designed to produce a sustained, controlled energy release rather than an instantaneous detonation, and to study how that sustained release interacted with the geophysical environment of the deep Antarctic ice. The distinction matters because it explains why what followed looked so different from a conventional nuclear accident. In a typical nuclear event, a reactor meltdown, a test detonation, an accidental criticality, the failure mode is visible. There is heat, there is light, there is physical destruction, there is radiation that propagates outward from the source in ways that can be detected and measured. Chernobyl was catastrophic precisely because it was visible. The graphite fire burned for days. The plume of radioactive material rose high enough into the atmosphere to be detected across Europe within 48 hours. You could not miss it. What the Icefall Protocol theory describes is something fundamentally different. Alleged partial report. Source unverified. Fragments only. Unverified witness accounts. Fragmentary, inconsistent in their details, but persistent in their broad outlines. Describe a sequence of events that unfolded over a period of several hours. There was electromagnetic interference of a kind that disrupted communications equipment across a radius that some accounts place at several hundred kilometres. There were communication blackouts at nearby stations that were attributed at the time to atmospheric disturbance. There were visual phenomena in the sky above the test site, not the aurora, which the personnel would have recognised, but something different, something lower, something that moved in ways that did not correspond to the patterns of auroral light. And then, in the internal documentation that the theory draws upon, documentation that remains unverified, that exist in fragments and partial transcriptions rather than confirmed originals, there is a phrase that mirrors, in its register of controlled alarm, the phrase from the McMurdo maintenance reports years earlier. Energy propagation exceeded projected containment parameters. Exceeded, not by a small margin, not in a way that was anticipated and planned for. The energy released by the experiment did not behave the way the models predicted. It did not dissipate upward, into the atmosphere, where its effects could be studied and measured. Instead, according to the theory, it propagated in a direction and in a manner that the experimental design had not accounted for. It went down and sideways, through the ice, through the rock, into the ancient geological substrate of the Antarctic continent, interacting with the magnetic and electromagnetic environment of the polar region in ways that no model had predicted and no instrument at the site had been calibrated to measure. The experiment, in the coldest and most clinical possible sense, had gotten away from the people conducting it. Unlike a conventional nuclear accident, there was no fireball, there was no visible destruction, there was no plume of smoke rising into the Antarctic sky. The ice around the test site did not melt visibly. The ground did not crack or crater in any way that would be visible from above. From the surface, from a distance, from a satellite photograph or an aerial survey, nothing would have looked wrong at all. That was the problem. And, from a certain perspective, that was also the solution. Part 4. The Aftermath. Containment beneath the ice. When something goes wrong in a classified program, the response follows a predictable logic, not the logic of transparency, not the logic of public safety in the way that those words are ordinarily understood, but the logic of control. The logic of limiting the spread of information to the smallest possible circle of people who need to know, while simultaneously managing whatever physical reality has been created. According to the Icefall Protocol theory, the response to the Antarctic event was immediate and comprehensive. The site was sealed. Personnel were evacuated under circumstances that, from the accounts of those who were there, were presented as precautionary and temporary. Data collected during the experiment was classified at a level that placed it beyond the reach of normal review processes. The individuals who had been directly involved were dispersed, reassigned to other programs, other locations, other projects, in a way that prevented any single person from holding a complete picture of what had occurred. It should be noted exactly how classified programs are managed under normal circumstances. The dispersal of knowledge, the compartmentalization of information, the physical separation of personnel after a sensitive operation. These are standard practices, not evidence of wrongdoing in themselves. The theory does not rest on the claim that the response was unusual in its methods. It rests on the claim that the response was disproportionate in its scale, and that the reasons given for the measures taken did not match the measures themselves. Here is where the Icefall Protocol diverges most sharply from the template of other Cold War nuclear incidents that have since been declassified and studied. At Chernobyl, the disaster was visible. The response, however inadequate and delayed it was, had to engage with a physical reality that could not be concealed. A destroyed reactor building, a burning graphite fire, a radiation plume spreading across international borders. The containment effort was ultimately a containment of information layered on top of an irreducibly physical event that could not be hidden. The Antarctic event, if it occurred, produced no such irreducible physical evidence at the surface. There was no building to destroy. There was no fire to observe from satellite imagery. There was no plume that would cross into airspace monitored by other nations. What had occurred, if anything, had occurred beneath kilometres of ice and rock, in a place where no independent observer had any reason to look, and no ability to access even if they had. The global impact theory, the most speculative and contested element of the Icefall Protocol narrative, suggests that the event did not simply dissipate harmlessly beneath the Antarctic ice. It suggests that the energy released, interacting with the geophysical environment of the polar region, may have produced changes that were subtle, diffuse, and global in their eventual reach, not dramatic. Changes, not the kind of changes that would trigger a monitoring alert or appear obviously in any single data set. Changes to atmospheric chemistry, changes to radiation distribution patterns, changes to the electromagnetic interactions between the Antarctic region and the broader systems of the planet. Antarctica is not a closed system. It is deeply interconnected with the rest of the Earth's climate, ocean, and atmospheric systems. The thermohaline circulation, the great engine of ocean currents that distributes heat and cold and nutrients across the entire planet, passes through the Southern Ocean. The polar vortex above Antarctica influences weather patterns across the Southern Hemisphere and, through complex interactions, into the Northern Hemisphere as well. The ice sheets themselves play a role in regulating global albedo, the planet's reflectivity, which is fundamental to the energy balance of the entire climate system. If something had genuinely altered the geophysical environment of the Antarctic region in 1968, the effects would not necessarily have appeared as a sudden, visible catastrophe. They might have appeared as a very slight, very slow, almost imperceptible drift in systems that were already complex enough that no single cause could easily be identified. They might have been invisible to every monitoring system of the era. They might have been invisible to every monitoring system since. That is the nature of a slow catastrophe. It looks exactly like the background noise of a world that is simply changing, as worlds have always changed. Part 5. 1972. The official closure. In 1972, the PM3A reactor at McMurdo Station was officially shut down. The stated reasons were familiar: logistical challenges, maintenance difficulties, the cost of managing a nuclear facility in such a remote and demanding environment. The reactor components were carefully disassembled and shipped back to the continental United States. The site was remediated, a process that involved the removal of a significant quantity of contaminated soil and rock, material that was transported to the Nevada test site for burial. All nuclear infrastructure at McMurdo was decommissioned. No replacement was installed. The official record treats this as an unremarkable conclusion to an interesting but ultimately impractical experiment, a reasonable decision made on rational grounds. Nothing more. The conspiracy theory notes the timing, 1972, 4 years after the alleged Antarctic event of 1968. 4 years during which, if the theory is correct, the individuals responsible for what had occurred would have had time to assess the full scope of what happened, to determine that no further large-scale experiments in that environment were advisable, and to remove every piece of nuclear infrastructure that might serve as evidence of what had been attempted. The shutdown of PM3A in this reading is not an unremarkable bureaucratic conclusion. It is the final act of a clean-up operation that began in the winter of 1968. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959 had established the continent as a zone of peaceful scientific cooperation, explicitly prohibiting nuclear explosions and the disposal of radioactive waste. That prohibition was always present. But in the years following the late 1960s, according to researchers who have studied the treaty's enforcement history, monitoring and compliance mechanisms became notably more rigorous. The consultative meetings of the treaty parties, which had been relatively low-key in the early years, became more structured, more frequent, and more focused on verification. To those who accept the conventional historical explanation, this is simply the natural maturation of a young international agreement as its parties gained experience and recognized the need for stronger mechanisms. Treaties, like any institutional structure, tend to become more elaborate over time as they encounter the complexity of the real world they were designed to govern. To those who find the Icefall Protocol theory compelling, the timing tells a different story. The reinforcement of Antarctic treaty mechanisms in the years following 1968 looks less like routine institutional development and more like a response to a specific recognition, a recognition that something had happened on the continent that the existing framework had been powerless to prevent, and that ensuring nothing similar happened again required a fundamentally different level of oversight. The theory cannot prove that the treaty's evolution was driven by this recognition. It simply notes that the timeline is consistent with it. and in the absence of complete documentation from the period, consistency with the timeline is precisely the kind of circumstantial evidence on which these theories tend to rest. Part 6. Modern Clues. What the ice still knows. Today, Antarctica is arguably the most intensively monitored uninhabited region on the planet. Dozens of research stations operated by nations from Argentina to India to China maintain continuous observation programs covering atmospheric chemistry, ice dynamics, seismic activity, magnetic field variations, cosmic ray flux, and dozens of other parameters. Satellites pass over the continent on every orbital cycle. Ice cores drilled from depths reaching more than 3 kilometers provide records of atmospheric conditions stretching back 800,000 years. The continent has been mapped in extraordinary detail from the surface and from the air and from space. No official radiation anomaly consistent with an undisclosed nuclear event in the late 1960s has been detected or reported by any of these programs, and yet theorists who follow the Icefall Protocol point to a number of features of the modern Antarctic data record that they find, if not conclusive, at least suggestive. Unusual patterns of ice melt in certain areas of the continent that do not correspond neatly to the atmospheric temperature changes that would be expected to drive them. Subglacial heat signatures, detectable through radar surveys that penetrate the ice, in locations where no known geological activity has been identified as the source. Restricted research zones in parts of the continent where access is limited by treaty provisions, logistical constraints, or, in some cases, by designations whose full rationale has not been publicly explained. Each of these phenomena has a scientific explanation that does not require invoking a classified Cold War nuclear experiment. Subglacial heat can be produced by geothermal activity that has not been fully characterized. Ice melt patterns are influenced by ocean temperature changes, by variations in wind patterns, by the complex dynamics of glacial movement that scientists are still working to fully understand. Restricted zones exist for reasons ranging from environmental protection to genuine logistical limitations. None of this is evidence of the Icefall Protocol. None of it comes close to proving that something happened beneath the Antarctic ice in the winter of 1968. What it does is create a landscape of ambiguity, a data environment in which unexplained observations exist, alongside official explanations that are plausible but not exhaustive, in which the absence of evidence is not quite the same as the evidence of absence. In the most remote place on Earth, every gap in the record looks like a possible door, and the problem with possible doors is that you cannot always tell whether they lead somewhere, or whether they were ever there at all. The missing data is perhaps the most genuinely interesting element of the modern picture. Early Antarctic research records, particularly those from the Cold War period, are incomplete in ways that archivists and historians have noted over the years. Some of this is simply the normal entropy of institutional record-keeping. Documents are lost, misfiled, damaged, or simply never created in the first place when operations are conducted informally or under the time pressure of field research. Some of it reflects the classification processes of the Cold War era, in which enormous volumes of material were routinely restricted in ways that have only been partially unwound in the decades since. Some of it may be something else entirely. The distinction is, for now, unknowable. Part 7. The Final Theory. The Invisible Chernobyl. The Icefall Protocol is, at its heart, a theory about invisibility. Not the invisibility of deliberate deception, though deliberate deception may have played a role. The deeper invisibility it describes is the invisibility of the environment itself, the way that a place remote enough, cold enough, and geophysically unusual enough might absorb an event that would be catastrophically visible anywhere else on Earth, and render it undetectable to every system designed to observe it. Chernobyl failed visibly, because it failed in a place where visibility was unavoidable. The Soviet Union, for all its institutional capacity for secrecy, could not prevent radioactive iodine from drifting into Sweden. It could not prevent the satellite images. It could not prevent the readings at nuclear power plants in other countries that first alerted the outside world that something was wrong. The physics of the disaster exceeded the politics of concealment. Antarctica is different. Antarctica might be the one place on Earth where the physics of concealment exceeds the physics of detection, where the ice and the cold and the distance and the electromagnetic complexity of the environment could absorb an event that anywhere else would announce itself unmistakably to the world. The theory does not claim that thousands of people died. It does not claim that the environment of the Southern Ocean was visibly poisoned, or that wildlife populations collapsed, or that any observer, however careful, detected anything wrong in the years that followed. What it claims is something subtler and, in many ways, more unsettling, that the consequences of the event, if there were consequences, were distributed across systems too large and too complex to allow any single cause to be identified, that the effects, if there were effects, looked like the normal background variation of a changing world, rather than the signature of a specific event at a specific time in a specific place. It is the perfect crime, if it was a crime at all, because the perpetrator, if there was one, is the environment itself. The Antarctic ice does not confess. The magnetic field does not leave a paper trail. The deep geological formations beneath the ice sheet do not file reports. Theoretical summary. Icefall. Protocol hypothesis. The hypothesis holds that a sustained nuclear energy release, conducted in an undisclosed location beneath the Antarctic ice sheet in the winter of 1968, interacted with the geophysical environment of the polar region in ways that exceeded the projected parameters of the experiment. The site was sealed, personnel were dispersed, the data was classified. The official nuclear infrastructure at McMurdo was subsequently decommissioned, providing cover for the removal of any remaining evidence of the broader program. The Antarctic Treaty's enforcement mechanisms were quietly strengthened, and the world, which had no way of knowing anything had happened, continued on exactly as if nothing had. There are no confirmed documents that establish the existence of the Icefall Protocol. There are no whistleblowers who have come forward with verifiable first-hand knowledge of the secret site. There are no radiation readings that cannot be explained by conventional geological or atmospheric processes. The theory exists in the space between what we know and what we cannot rule out, in the gap between the official record, which is incomplete, and the complete historical reality, which may never be known. That gap is real. The Cold War generated classified programs of extraordinary ambition and extraordinary concealment, many of which were not publicly acknowledged until decades after they occurred, and some of which remain classified to this day. The documented history of MK Ultra, of Operation Sea Spray, of the MK Ultra drug testing programs, of the nuclear tests conducted on American servicemen without their knowledge. These are not conspiracy theories. These are documented historical facts that were, for years or decades, denied by the governments responsible for them. The question is not whether governments conduct classified experiments that they do not disclose to the public. They do. The question is whether this particular experiment in this particular place at this particular time was one of them. That question, for now, remains open. There is a concept in intelligence analysis known as the absence of signal. In most investigative contexts, the absence of evidence is taken as evidence of absence. If something happened, there would be a trace, and if there is no trace, then nothing happened. But experienced analysts know that this reasoning has a critical flaw. The absence of a signal can mean one of two things. It can mean that nothing occurred, or it can mean that something occurred in an environment so hostile to observation, or so thoroughly managed by those who controlled it, that the normal mechanisms of detection were never able to engage. Antarctica in the 1960s was both of those things simultaneously. It was genuinely hostile to observation, remote, inaccessible, enveloped in polar winter darkness for months at a time, surrounded by an ocean. That was itself among the most difficult in the world to navigate or monitor, and it was managed, to the extent that any human presence existed there at all, by a small number of nations operating under the significant secrecy norms of the Cold War era, in which compartmentalization of information was not a bureaucratic inconvenience, but a deeply embedded institutional practice. In that environment, the absence of a signal from the winter of 1968 tells you very little. It might mean nothing happened. It might mean something happened and was never detectable by the instruments of the era. It might mean something happened and was detected, and the detection was classified. It might mean something happened and everyone who knew about it has since died, or has chosen not to speak, or has spoken in ways that did not reach the mainstream record. All of those possibilities exist simultaneously. None can be ruled out with the information currently available, and that ambiguity is not a failure of the theory. It is the theory's most honest and most accurate statement about the nature of the historical record it is trying to interrogate. One thing that is worth considering as we try to evaluate the Icefall Protocol is the broader pattern of Cold War nuclear history that has been definitively established through declassification. Because the story of what governments actually did with nuclear technology during the Cold War, the confirmed, documented, verified story, is already strange enough to strain credulity if you encountered it as fiction. The United States conducted 235 atmospheric nuclear tests between 1945 and 1962, many of them observed by military personnel positioned deliberately close to the blast sites to study the effects of nuclear weapons on troops. The long-term health consequences for those personnel were largely ignored and then denied for decades. The Soviet Union conducted 115 atmospheric tests during roughly the same period, some of them over populated areas of Kazakhstan and Siberia, with consequences for local populations that are still being studied. Operation Plowshare, which ran from 1957 into the 1970s, proposed using nuclear detonations for large-scale civil engineering projects, excavating harbours, cutting through mountain ranges for canals, creating underground cavities for gas storage. 27 nuclear tests were conducted under this program. The idea of using nuclear explosions to dig canals was not science fiction. It was official government policy with a budget and a timeline. Project Orion proposed propelling a spacecraft through space using nuclear detonations. The mathematics worked. The engineering was feasible. The project reached serious design stages before it was eventually cancelled, partly on the grounds of the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which prohibited nuclear detonations in the atmosphere, underwater and in outer space. Against this backdrop, against the confirmed historical reality of governments that use nuclear technology in ways that would seem implausible if they were not thoroughly documented, the idea that a classified experiment might have been conducted in Antarctica in the late 1960s is not, in itself, extraordinary. What would be extraordinary is if the ambition and risk tolerance that characterised the nuclear programs of the Cold War era somehow stopped at the Antarctic coastline and went no further. The ice is not a natural boundary for human ambition. It never has been. Epilogue. Antarctica today. Right now, as you listen to these words, Antarctica is one of the most scientifically significant places on Earth. Researchers from dozens of nations are stationed at bases across the continent, conducting work that ranges from climate science and glaciology to astrophysics and marine biology. The continent is a zone of international cooperation unlike almost anywhere else on the planet. A place where geopolitical rivals work alongside each other in shared facilities, sharing data and resources and the extraordinary hardship of living at the edge of the habitable world. It is, officially, the most peaceful continent on Earth. No military installations, no territorial claims recognised by the international community, no nuclear weapons, no nuclear reactors, no classified experiments. The Antarctic Treaty, now signed by more than 50 nations, is one of the most successful arms control agreements in history, a model of what international cooperation can achieve when the stakes are high enough and the will is present. That is the official picture. It is, in many respects, a genuinely beautiful picture. It is the product of real political effort and real scientific cooperation and real good faith on the part of the nations and the individuals who have made it work. But Antarctica also has a history, and that history, like all histories, contains chapters that have not been fully written, archives that have not been fully opened, questions that have not been fully answered, records from the Cold War period that are incomplete in ways that may reflect nothing more sinister than the ordinary entropy of institutional memory, or may reflect something that no one in a position to disclose it has yet chosen to disclose. It is worth sitting with that thought for a moment. The Cold War ended more than 3 decades ago. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. The intelligence agencies and military establishments that conducted the classified programs of that era have been subject to decades of declassification requests, Freedom of Information Act filings, congressional inquiries, and investigative journalism. Enormous volumes of material have been released. The history of that period is far better, understood now than it was in the years immediately following its conclusion, and yet there are still classified programs from the 1960s that have not been fully disclosed, still documents that remain restricted under national security classifications, still gaps in the record that historians cannot fill because the records that would fill them are not available. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is the documented reality of how government archives work. Some material is released, some is destroyed. Some sits in boxes in federal records facilities, accessible to researchers who know to ask for it. And some remains classified, reviewed periodically by officials who determine, each time they look at it, that it has not yet reached the point of declassification. What sits in those boxes we cannot know. What those periodic reviews have determined, we cannot know. Whether any of those documents bear any relationship to the events described in the Icefall Protocol theory, we cannot know. That is the honest answer. And it is, paradoxically, also the answer that keeps theories like this one alive. Because a history with no gaps would leave no room for questions. And a history full of gaps, verifiable, documented, confirmed gaps, is a history that will always generate the question that gaps inevitably produce. What was there? Fukushima taught the world something important. It taught us that in the age of global monitoring, a nuclear event cannot be hidden. The infrastructure of observation is too dense. The instruments are too sensitive. The information too difficult to contain. But Fukushima happened in 2011. The world of 1968 was a different world entirely. A world of fewer satellites, of more fragile communication networks, of vastly larger swathes of the planet that existed, for practical purposes, beyond the reach of any observation at all. Antarctica, in 1968, was one of those places, and if something happened there, in the ice, beneath the ice, in the cold and the dark of a polar winter, in a place where the nearest inhabited settlement was hundreds of miles away, it might not have looked like a disaster at all. It might have looked like nothing. A fluctuation in an instrument reading, a communication blackout attributed to weather, a light in the sky that the small number of people present had no framework to interpret. It might have looked, from the outside, exactly like the undisturbed, empty white silence that Antarctica has always presented to the world, and that is precisely what would make it impossible to prove. Chernobyl showed us what happens when nuclear containment fails in a place where the world is watching. The Icefall Protocol asks a different question. What happens when it fails in the one place on Earth where no one is watching at all? What happens when the environment itself becomes the containment? When the ice and the cold and the darkness and the distance absorb an event that would be catastrophic anywhere else, and leave behind nothing that the instruments of the modern world can distinguish from the ordinary silence of a continent that has been silent for tens of millions of years? We may never know the answer, and perhaps that is the most Antarctic answer of all. To the sleepy koala army, listening from wherever you are in the world tonight, thank you. Antarctica is 3,000 miles from the nearest major population centre, but the questions it holds are as close as the world we live in. If this episode found you and kept you company through the night, that is everything this channel is for. Drop a comment and tell me where you are listening from. Are you in the southern hemisphere, closer to the ice than most? Are you somewhere in the middle of the world, the continent a distant abstraction? Are you somewhere that gets cold enough in winter to make tonight's story feel a little more real? I want to know. The sleepy koala army spans every time zone on this planet, and that never stops amazing me. Sleep well, stay curious, and remember, the most frightening stories are not the ones that end with an explosion. They are the ones that end with silence. The ice does not speak. It only holds. And what it holds, in its deep layers and its ancient darkness, belongs to time in a way that few human secrets ever do. We drill into it and read its records and learn what the atmosphere contained 800,000 years ago, what volcanoes erupted and what temperatures prevailed, and what particles fell from the sky in the long millennia before any human being had set eyes on the continent. But the ice keeps some things that are harder to read, things that are not encoded in isotopes or air bubbles or volcanic ash, things that left their mark in ways that our instruments have not yet learned to find, or perhaps in ways that were carefully ensured would never be findable at all. That is the final thought the Icefall Protocol leaves us with. Not fear, not certainty, not even confident suspicion. Just the awareness that the world we know is built on a foundation that contains more rooms than we have keys to, that the official record is real and important and valuable, and also incomplete in ways that are sometimes accidental and sometimes not, that the Cold War was stranger and more ambitious and more reckless than the sanitized version of history tends to acknowledge, and that Antarctica, sitting at the bottom of the world in its permanent white silence, has been a witness to more of human history than it has ever been asked to testify about. We may never know what it witnessed in the winter of 1968, but the question itself is worth holding, worth sitting with in the quiet of the night, worth carrying into the morning. Because the questions we cannot fully answer are often the ones that tell us the most about the limits of what we know, and about the vast, cold, silent, ancient territory of what we do not. Go gently into the night. Sleep well. The ice will still be there in the morning, keeping whatever it keeps. If something had happened beneath miles of Antarctic ice, it might not look like a disaster at all. It might look like nothing, and that is precisely what would make it impossible to prove. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It really helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review helps out so much as well. Also, feel free to comment what time it is for you and where in the world you're listening from, but only if you want to. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. And of course, if you enjoy the content, subscribing really helps us keep bringing you these stories. Now let's get into tonight's investigation. A huge thank you to Justin for suggesting this topic. This one's fascinating, and honestly, it might be one of the most important stories we've ever covered. Imagine being the most decorated soldier in your nation's history. You've bled for your country on 4 different continents, led men through hell, earned the highest honours your military can bestow not once but twice. Now imagine that the wealthiest men in America approach you in secret with a proposal that would change everything. They want you to lead 500,000 armed veterans in a march on the nation's capital. They want you to force the president into submission. They want you to install yourself as a military dictator backed by the largest corporations in the country. This isn't fiction. This isn't speculation. This is the sworn testimony of a man who had no reason to lie and everything to lose by speaking. The year was 1934, and America came within a conversation of becoming a fascist state. The men who planned it walked free. Their names were largely protected, and the story was buried so thoroughly that most Americans have never heard of it. Until now. Prologue. The most decorated Marine speaks out. November 20th, 1934, Washington. The halls of Congress rarely deal in sensational claims. Procedures, budgets, debates over policy. These are the standard fare. Senators and representatives have heard wild accusations before. Conspiracy theories, political grandstanding, attention-seeking witnesses looking for their moment in the spotlight. The committees have learned to filter noise from signal. So when a retired Major General requests to give testimony about an attempted overthrow of the government, the initial response is scepticism. Another crank with delusions of importance. Another veteran unable to adjust to civilian life, seeing conspiracies in every shadow. Then someone looks at the name on the testimony request. Smedley Darlington Butler. The room changes. Suddenly this is not a routine hearing. Butler does not arrive with bodyguards, though given what he is about to say, perhaps he should. He does not bring lawyers or prepared statements crafted by political handlers. He does not have a book to sell or a political career to launch. He walks in alone, a man in his 50s with the bearing of someone who has spent his entire adult life in service to his country. The committee members know who Butler is. Every military officer in America knows who Butler is. He has earned the Medal of Honor twice. Only a handful of men in American history can make that claim. He has fought in China, Nicaragua, Haiti, and the trenches of World War I. He has commanded thousands of men in combat. He has been offered promotions to the highest ranks and turned them down because he disagreed with the politics behind them. Presidents have shaken his hand, and now he's about to tell Congress that some of the wealthiest and most powerful men in America tried to recruit him to lead a military coup. The committee chairman, Representative John McCormack, calls the hearing to order. Butler is sworn in. His voice is steady as he begins to speak, not angry, not fearful, simply factual, the way a military officer delivers a situation report. He provides names: Gerald Maguire, a bond salesman with connections to Wall Street, specific dates, summer of 1933, multiple meetings at his home in Pennsylvania. He describes conversations that began innocuously, about veteran organisations and political influence, that gradually escalated into something far more sinister. Butler tells them about trips Maguire made to Europe, studying how Mussolini organised his fascist state in Italy, how Hitler was consolidating power in Germany. He describes plans to recruit 500,000 veterans, men who trusted him, men who had followed him into battle, men who would follow him one more time. But this time, the battle would not be against a foreign enemy. This time, the battle would be for control of America itself. The plan, as Butler describes it, was sophisticated. Not a violent overthrow, not tanks in the streets, something more subtle. A massive peaceful march on Washington that would nevertheless carry the implicit threat of overwhelming military force. The imagery alone would be powerful. 500,000 trained soldiers, many of them desperate and angry about the Depression, united behind the most famous general in America. And what would they demand? According to Maguire's alleged pitch, they would force President Franklin Roosevelt to appoint a Secretary of General Affairs, a new position that would effectively run the government. Roosevelt would remain as president in name, a figurehead for public consumption. But real power would shift to this new office, and who would hold this position? Butler himself. The committee members lean forward. This is not the rambling of a disturbed mind. This is specific. This is detailed. This is, if true, an actual attempted coup. Butler does not speculate about motives. He does not editorialise. He simply lays out the facts as he experienced them. Who contacted him, what they said, what they offered, what they planned. He tells them he did not agree. That he continued meeting with Maguire, gathering information, trying to understand the full scope of what was being proposed. And that when he finally understood how serious this was, he knew he had only one option: expose it. Butler does not ask for protection. He does not demand action. He simply presents his testimony and waits for Congress to respond. The committee will investigate. They will interview witnesses. They will examine documents. They will attempt to corroborate Butler's extraordinary claims, and in the end they will confirm that discussions about removing President Franklin Roosevelt did indeed take place. They will state explicitly that a fascist organisation was planned and might have been executed, but no one will be prosecuted, no major financiers will be subpoenaed, no corporate executives will face charges, and the story will quietly disappear from the headlines, buried beneath other news, forgotten by a public already overwhelmed by economic catastrophe. This is the story of the business plot, the coup that almost was, the conspiracy that involved some of the most powerful men in America, the warning that we ignored, and the question of whether it could happen again. Chapter 1. America on the Brink. To understand why anyone would even consider overthrowing the American government, you have to understand what America looked like in the early 1930s, and more importantly, you have to understand how terrified the wealthy elite were of what was happening. The Great Depression has destroyed the country, not metaphorically, not in an exaggerated sense. It has genuinely devastated the nation in ways that most modern Americans cannot fully comprehend. Unemployment exceeds 25%. That's 1 in 4 working-age Americans without a job. In some cities, the number is closer to 40%. No unemployment insurance exists, no federal safety net, no food stamps or welfare programs. If you lose your job, you lose everything. Your home, your savings, your future. Banks are collapsing at an unprecedented rate. Between 1930 and 1933, over 9,000 banks fail. 9,000. People's life savings vanish overnight. Elderly couples who spent decades building retirement funds find themselves destitute. Small businesses close because they cannot access credit. Farms are foreclosed by the thousands. Hunger is everywhere. Breadlines stretch for blocks in every major city. Children go to school with empty stomachs. Families survive on bread and watered-down soup. Malnutrition rates skyrocket. People are literally starving in the richest country in the world. Shanty towns spring up on the edges of cities, makeshift communities of cardboard and scrap metal that people sarcastically call Hoovervilles after President Herbert Hoover, who many blame for the crisis. Families live in shacks made from packing crates. Children play in dirt streets. Disease spreads, and the government does virtually nothing. In the summer of 1932, something happens that shakes the nation's confidence even further. Thousands of World War I veterans march on Washington demanding early payment of bonuses they were promised for their service. These are not radicals. These are not communists or anarchists. These are soldiers who fought for America, who risked their lives in France, who came home to a country that thanked them with parades and then forgot about them. Now they are desperate. Many are homeless. Their families are hungry. The bonus payments are not due until 1945, but they need help now. They set up camps in Washington, peaceful protests asking their government for assistance. The government's response reveals how deeply the elite fear popular movements. President Hoover orders the military to clear the camps. General Douglas MacArthur, who will play his own role in conspiracy theories throughout his career, leads the operation. Tanks roll through the streets of Washington. Soldiers use tear gas on veterans. Cavalry charges disperse crowds. The camps are burned. Men who fought for their country are treated like enemy combatants. This event is critical to understanding the business plot. It proves that the military will fire on American citizens if ordered. It demonstrates that when the establishment feels threatened, it responds with force, and it creates a deep reservoir of anger among veterans that men like Butler could potentially tap into. This is the America that Franklin Delano Roosevelt inherits when he takes office in March 1933. Roosevelt moves fast. Within his first 100 days, he launches the New Deal, a sweeping series of programs designed to pull America out of the Depression. Federal spending increases dramatically. New agencies are created: the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, the Social Security Administration. Banking regulations are imposed through the Glass-Steagall Act. Labour unions gain protection through the National Industrial Recovery Act. The government expands its role in the economy in ways that would have been unthinkable just years before. For millions of suffering Americans, Roosevelt is a saviour. His fireside chats on the radio provide hope. His programs provide jobs. His rhetoric provides dignity to the unemployed and dispossessed. For the wealthy elite, however, Roosevelt is something far more dangerous. He is a traitor to his class. Roosevelt comes from old money. His family is part of the American aristocracy. He attended the best schools. He married into the right circles. By all rights, he should be defending the interests of his class against the demands of the masses. Instead, he is siding with the masses against his own class. Corporate executives watch in horror as their power is curtailed. Banking elites see their freedom to operate without oversight disappear. Industrialists face new regulations and union protections that threaten profit margins. These men have spent decades building empires with minimal government interference, and now a president is telling them that the rules have changed, that workers have rights, that the government can regulate business, that profit cannot be the only consideration. To many wealthy Americans, this is not reform. This is socialism. This is the first step toward communism. This is the end of everything they have built. Some of them begin to look elsewhere for solutions. Across the Atlantic Ocean, a different kind of government is rising. In Italy, Benito Mussolini has created a fascist state that promises order, discipline, and most importantly for business interests, the complete suppression of labour movements and socialist organising. Strikes are illegal. Unions are controlled by the state. Workers are disciplined. Trains run on time, and corporate profits are protected by military force. In Germany, Adolf Hitler is consolidating power through a similar model. He crushes the Communist Party, destroys independent unions, and creates a system where business and government work hand in hand, as long as business understands who is really in charge. And some American elites are watching, not with horror, with interest, with a growing sense that perhaps this model could work in America. These European governments don't have labour strikes. They don't have socialist movements threatening to redistribute wealth. They don't have presidents who side with workers over owners. They have strong leaders who keep business running smoothly, who suppress dissent efficiently, who promise stability even at the cost of freedom. If it can work there, some begin to wonder, why not here? The ground is fertile for something unprecedented in American history. The economy is shattered. Trust in government is eroding. Millions of veterans trained in combat and accustomed to following orders are unemployed and angry. And the president is implementing policies that threaten the very foundation of corporate power. All it would take is the right leader. Someone with credibility among veterans. Someone who could be presented as saving America rather than destroying it. Someone who veterans would follow without question. Someone exactly like Smedley Butler. The question was not whether someone would try. The question was when and how carefully they would plan it. Chapter 2. Who was Smedley Butler? Smedley Darlington Butler was born in 1881 in Westchester, Pennsylvania. His father, Thomas Butler, was a lawyer who would eventually serve in the US House of Representatives for over 30 years. His mother came from a prominent Quaker family, people of peace who nevertheless understood duty and service. The family was respectable, educated, politically connected. Young Smedley could have chosen any number of comfortable careers: law, politics, business. A life of ease and influence awaited him. Instead, at age 16, he lied about his age and enlisted in the Marine Corps during the Spanish-American War. This decision would define everything that followed. Butler's military career reads like something out of an adventure novel, except every word is documented military history. He serves in Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, Mexico, Haiti, and China. He fights in the Boxer Rebellion, where foreign powers carve up China like a pie, and Butler sees firsthand how military force serves economic interests. He participates in the occupation of Veracruz during the Mexican Revolution. He helps suppress rebellions in Haiti, an occupation that will later haunt his conscience. He earns the Medal of Honor not once, but twice. The first comes in 1914 during the Veracruz incident. The second comes in 1915 in Haiti. He is one of only 19 men in American history to receive this distinction twice. Even among this elite group, Butler stands out for the sheer number of combat situations he survives. Stories about Butler become legend among Marines. Once, while fighting in Haiti against rebel forces, he personally led his men in an assault on a fortress built into a mountain. The approach was up a sheer cliff face under heavy fire. Butler climbed ahead of his troops, drawing fire, refusing to order men into danger he wouldn't face himself. When they took the fortress, Butler's uniform was torn and burned from bullets that nearly killed him. Another time, during an operation in China, Butler learned that a railway was being used to transport rebel reinforcements. Rather than engage in a prolonged battle, he simply had his men tear up several miles of track overnight. The reinforcements never arrived. The rebellion collapsed without a major fight. But Butler is more than just brave. He is genuinely concerned about his men in a way that is unusual for officers of his era. He fights constantly for better conditions, better equipment, better pay. He personally inspects food supplies and medical facilities. He writes letters to the families of men killed under his command. Marines under his command know that their general will not waste their lives unnecessarily, and that he will be right there with them when danger comes. By the 1920s, Butler is one of the most famous military figures in America. He is appointed Director of Public Safety in Philadelphia, where he attempts to clean up rampant corruption in the police department. He makes enemies among political bosses and organised crime figures by actually enforcing laws. After 2 years, the pressure becomes too great and he returns to military service. He gives speeches across the country. Veterans admire him. The public knows his name. He's offered promotions to the highest ranks of the Marine Corps, but turns them down when he disagrees with the politics behind them. Then something changes in Butler's perspective. As he looks back at his decades of service, he begins to see patterns that disturb him profoundly. He realizes that many of the military operations he participated in were not about defending America. They were about defending American corporate interests abroad. He helped suppress revolutions that threatened American companies. He protected banana plantations in Central America. He secured mining rights in Haiti. He ensured that American banks could collect debts from foreign governments. He begins speaking out about this. Not quietly, not tactfully, loudly and publicly. In 1935, he'll publish a short book called War is a Racket. In it, he'll write something that shocks many Americans. I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico, especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of 6 Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. The record of racketeering is long. This is not a minor figure making wild claims. This is one of the most decorated officers in American military history explicitly stating that he was used as an enforcer for corporate interests. But in 1933, when the approach comes, Butler is still a respected figure who has not yet fully articulated these ideas. He has retired from active duty but remains deeply connected to veteran communities. He gives speeches criticising corporate influence and war profiteering, but he is not considered radical or dangerous. He is simply a general speaking uncomfortable truths that most people choose to ignore. This makes him perfect for what comes next. He is famous enough to command instant loyalty from veterans across the country. He is critical enough of the establishment to seem like he might be sympathetic to dramatic change. He has demonstrated willingness to stand up to authority when he believes it is corrupt. But he is not so radical that approaching him would be obviously insane. Whoever decided to recruit Butler understood these factors carefully. They had done their research. They knew his background, his beliefs, his influence. They chose well. What they did not anticipate, what they could not have known, was that Butler's criticism of corporate power was not a performance. It was not positioning for future political office. It was not rhetorical flourish for applause at veteran gatherings. It was genuine conviction, born from decades of experience, from seeing how power really operates, from recognising his own role in a system he had come to despise. and when they approached him with their proposal, they would learn exactly how deep that conviction ran. They would learn that Smedley Butler could not be bought, could not be flattered into compliance, could not be convinced that overthrowing democracy was patriotic. They chose the right man for their purposes. They just chose the wrong man to trust. Chapter 3. The Approach. The first contact comes in the summer of 1933, just months after Roosevelt takes office and begins implementing the New Deal. Gerald Curly Maguire is a bond salesman working for Grayson M.P. Murphy and Company, a prestigious Wall Street brokerage firm. On the surface, there is nothing particularly remarkable about Maguire. He is 43 years old, well-dressed, well-spoken, the type of man who can move comfortably in rooms full of money and power without being the centre of attention. He is connected to the American Legion, one of the largest veteran organisations in the country, serving as commander of a Connecticut post. He moves in circles of wealth and influence, but is not himself a major figure. He is what intelligence operatives would call a cutout, someone who makes contact without revealing who is really behind the operation. Maguire approaches Butler with what seems, initially, like a modest and reasonable proposal. He wants Butler's help in influencing the American Legion's annual convention. The Legion is considering resolutions about monetary policy, specifically about whether America should return to the gold standard. This is not an obscure economic debate. The gold standard question represents a fundamental divide between different economic interests. Banks and wealthy bondholders favour gold because it protects their holdings from inflation. Workers and farmers oppose it because it makes debt harder to pay off and restricts government's ability to stimulate the economy. Maguire claims that he represents a group of wealthy Legion members who want to ensure the convention votes the right way. He offers Butler money to attend the convention and use his influence. It is presented as simple political organising, the kind of thing that happens all the time. Butler listens but is non-committal. Something about Maguire does not sit right with him. The offer seems reasonable on its face, but Butler has spent too many years around men with hidden agendas to take anything at face value. He senses something beneath the surface of this request, but cannot quite identify it. Maguire persists. Over the following months he makes multiple visits to Butler's home in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania. Each time he brings more information. Each time the conversation evolves and deepens. What begins as discussions about the American Legion gradually transforms into something far more ambitious and far more dangerous. According to Butler's later testimony, Maguire begins describing trips to Europe. He claims to have travelled extensively, studying how different governments operate. He talks about Italy, where Mussolini has created a system that efficiently combines corporate interest with authoritarian control. He speaks admiringly of how Mussolini dealt with labour problems. He simply made strikes illegal and arrested union organisers. How Mussolini dealt with political opposition. He outlawed other parties and imprisoned dissidents. How Mussolini maintains order through paramilitary groups that enforce discipline with violence when necessary. Maguire is not critical of these methods. He presents them as solutions. Then Maguire starts talking about veterans, about how many former soldiers are unemployed and desperate, about how they feel betrayed by a government that sent them to war and then abandoned them during the Depression, about how they could be organised, mobilised, given purpose and direction again. 500,000 men, he suggests, maybe more, all veterans, all trained in military tactics, all potentially loyal to a leader they respect. The conversations become more explicit over time. Maguire describes a plan that has clearly been developed in detail, not improvised during their meetings. A march on Washington, he explains. Not violent, he insists repeatedly. Peaceful, but overwhelming. 500,000 veterans descending on the Capitol in a show of force that cannot be ignored. The imagery alone would be powerful. The implicit threat of what 500,000 trained soldiers could do if pushed would be even more powerful. And what would they demand? According to Butler's testimony, the goal is to force Roosevelt aside, not necessarily to remove him entirely, Maguire emphasises, as if this distinction makes the plan less treasonous. The president would remain as a figurehead, someone to give speeches and attend ceremonies, but real power would shift to a new position, Secretary of General Affairs, a person who would effectively run the government, make the actual decisions, control policy, while Roosevelt remains as a symbolic leader for public consumption. And who would be this Secretary of General Affairs? Maguire suggests that Butler himself would be the ideal candidate. Who better than the most decorated Marine in American history? Who better than someone veterans trust implicitly? Who better than a general with no political ambitions, no partisan affiliations, simply a patriot trying to save his country from Roosevelt's dangerous socialist experiment? Butler does not immediately refuse. This is important to understand. He does not throw Maguire out of his house. He does not call the police or report him to authorities. Instead, he continues to listen, asking questions, probing deeper. He wants to understand exactly who is behind this and how serious they are. He wants to know if this is one delusional bond salesman with fantasies of importance, or if this represents something much larger and much more dangerous. Maguire provides reassurance on both counts. He mentions backers, wealthy men, men with resources, men who understand that Roosevelt is destroying America and that drastic measures may be necessary. He never provides a complete list of names, but the implications are clear. This is not some fringe conspiracy. This involves people with real power and real money, people who can provide the funding necessary to organise such a massive movement. Butler asks specific questions. What about weapons? Maguire assures him that would not be a problem. Equipment can be acquired. Connections exist to military suppliers. Some veterans still have their service weapons. More can be obtained. Butler asks about public support. Maguire insists that millions of Americans are ready for change, that the New Deal is destroying individual liberty, that strong leadership is necessary to prevent complete economic collapse or communist revolution. He frames the coup not as overthrowing America, but as saving it. Butler asks about the military. What happens when regular army units are ordered to stop 500,000 veterans? Maguire seems confident this will not be a problem. Many officers, he suggests, are themselves unhappy with Roosevelt. The military may not interfere, and if they do, the presence of so many veterans makes violent suppression politically impossible. But Butler is not convinced. Or rather, he is convinced that something serious is being planned. But he is not convinced that it is right. He is not convinced that replacing democracy with dictatorship, even a supposedly benevolent one, is acceptable. He's not convinced that men who wear nice suits and speak about patriotism are actually patriots rather than oligarchs protecting their wealth. He continues meeting with Maguire throughout late 1933 and into early 1934, gathering information, learning more about the conspiracy. And all the while, a decision is forming in his mind about what he will do with this information. Maguire has no idea that every conversation is being remembered, every detail filed away, every name and connection noted. He believes he is successfully recruiting Butler. He believes the general's questions indicate interest rather than investigation. He is wrong. Butler is gathering evidence, building a case, preparing to do the one thing that will stop this plot before it can truly begin. He is preparing to expose it all. Chapter 4. Following the Money. If Gerald Maguire was simply a rogue bond salesman with delusions of grandeur and no real backing, Butler's story would be interesting but ultimately insignificant. A strange historical footnote about one man's fantasy taken too seriously. What makes the business plot compelling, what makes it genuinely disturbing, is the evidence that Maguire had access to substantial resources and connections to some of the most powerful interests in America. Let's follow the money. Maguire works for Grayson MP Murphy and Company, a Wall Street brokerage firm with deep connections to America's financial elite. Grayson Murphy himself is not just a businessman. He's a director of Guarantee Trust Company, which has close ties to J.P. Morgan. He's a director of Bethlehem Steel, one of the largest industrial corporations in America. He served as a military officer in World War I, giving him connections to the veteran community. He moves effortlessly between worlds of finance, industry, and military affairs. J.P. Morgan Jr., son of the legendary financier, runs one of the most powerful banking institutions in the world. The Morgan interests control or influence dozens of major corporations, railroads, utilities, and financial institutions. When Roosevelt implements banking reforms, when he pushes for greater regulation, when he supports higher taxes on the wealthy, the Morgan interests are among those most directly threatened. But the connections go deeper and become even more intriguing. In August 1934, just months before Butler testifies to Congress, a new organisation forms called the American Liberty League. Its stated purpose is to oppose the New Deal and advocate for free enterprise and limited government. This sounds innocuous, like any number of political advocacy groups, but look at who funds it. The DuPont family contributes heavily. Pierre DuPont, Irénée DuPont, and Lamont DuPont are all involved. The DuPonts control DuPont Chemical, one of the largest corporations in America. They also control General Motors through extensive stock holdings. John Jacob Raskob joins as a major supporter. Raskob is a former chairman of General Motors and a former chairman of the Democratic National Committee, a man with connections spanning business and politics. Alfred Sloan, president of General Motors, becomes involved. Andrew Mellon, one of the wealthiest men in America and former Secretary of the Treasury, lends his name. Executives from Standard Oil, Goodyear Tire, and dozens of other major corporations join. These are not fringe figures. These are not minor businessmen angry about taxes. These are titans of American industry who collectively control a substantial portion of the American economy. The American Liberty League operates openly, publishing materials opposing the New Deal, lobbying against specific policies, giving speeches about the dangers of expanding government power. This is legal. This is protected speech. There is nothing inherently sinister about wealthy people advocating for their economic interests through legitimate political channels. But historians note the timing. The Liberty League forms right around the time Butler goes public with his allegations about a fascist plot. Its membership includes exactly the kind of corporate interests who would have been most threatened by Roosevelt's policies. And its rhetoric often echoes the themes Maguire allegedly discussed with Butler. That Roosevelt is destroying American freedom, that strong action may be necessary to save the country, that business interests must organise to protect themselves. Was the Liberty League connected to the plot Butler described? No direct evidence proves this, but the overlap is impossible to ignore. Butler's testimony includes other details that suggest serious backing beyond Maguire's personal resources. Maguire claimed to have travelled to Europe specifically to study fascist governments and how they organise paramilitary movements. Such a trip would require substantial funding and clear purpose. Business travellers don't casually spend months touring Italy and Germany studying political systems. Congressional investigators later confirmed that Maguire did indeed make these European trips. This is documented fact, not speculation. So he had access to money for extended international travel during the Depression, when most Americans could barely afford food. Maguire allegedly spoke to Butler about access to weapons and equipment for equipping hundreds of thousands of veterans. Either this was complete fabrication, or he had connections to military suppliers and confidence that funding would be available. He discussed specific plans for organising veteran groups, strategies for recruitment, logistics for moving masses of people to Washington. This level of detail suggests either serious planning or an impressively elaborate fantasy. The congressional committee that later investigated found Maguire's story partially corroborated. They confirmed he had made trips to Europe. They confirmed conversations between Maguire and Butler took place exactly as Butler described. They found evidence of discussions about organising veterans for political purposes. What they did not find, or at least did not make public, was direct documentation of funding sources or explicit approval from major corporate figures. No paper trail connected specific wealthy individuals to the plot. No documents surfaced showing corporate board meetings where overthrowing the government was discussed. This is where the conspiracy deepens rather than dissolves, because the absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence, especially when dealing with sophisticated people who understand how to insulate themselves from risk. Powerful people do not write memos about treason. They do not create paper trails connecting them to coup attempts. They use intermediaries, cutouts, people like Maguire who can make contact without revealing who is really behind the operation. If the plot succeeds, the real backers reveal themselves and reap the rewards. If it fails, the intermediary takes the fall while the masterminds remain untouchable. This is basic tradecraft for anyone engaged in illegal or politically dangerous activities. So the question is not whether there is explicit documentation connecting wealthy elites to the business plot. The question is whether the circumstantial evidence is strong enough to suggest their involvement, despite the lack of explicit proof. Gerald Maguire had European travel funding during the Depression. He had access to people with resources. He spoke confidently about acquiring weapons and equipment. He made specific references to wealthy backers. His employer was connected to the Morgan interests, and an organisation formed by many of the same interests he allegedly represented appeared right as the plot was being exposed. Butler would later say that he believed Maguire was a messenger for far more powerful figures, that the bond salesman was not the architect but merely the recruiter, that if he had agreed to the plan, the real players would have revealed themselves, providing the funding and support necessary to execute the operation. But Butler did not agree, and so the identities of those real players, if they existed beyond Maguire's imagination, remained hidden in the shadows where powerful people prefer to operate. Chapter 5. Congress Investigates. On November 20th, 1934, the Special Committee on Un-American Activities, commonly known as the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, hears extraordinary testimony from Smedley, Darlington, Butler. The committee is chaired by Representatives John McCormick of Massachusetts and Samuel Dickstein of New York. It was originally formed to investigate Nazi propaganda activities in the United States, part of a growing concern about foreign influence in American politics. The timing is significant. Hitler has consolidated power in Germany. Fascist movements are growing across Europe, and American politicians are beginning to worry that similar ideologies might take root in the United States. Butler's allegations expand their mandate considerably. This is not about foreign propaganda. This is about domestic conspiracy. This is about American citizens, wealthy and powerful American citizens, allegedly plotting to overthrow the American government. The hearing room is not packed with reporters. This is not a public spectacle with cameras and dramatic confrontations. It is a relatively quiet congressional hearing, the kind that happens regularly in Washington, attended by committee members, a few staff members, and minimal press coverage. Butler speaks for hours. His testimony is methodical, detailed, and disturbing. He provides specific dates for his meetings with Maguire. He recounts conversations nearly word for word, the way someone with military training remembers briefings and debriefings. He describes how Maguire's approach evolved over months, from seemingly innocent discussions about veteran politics to explicit plans for marching on Washington and installing a dictator. He names names where he can. Gerald Maguire is identified explicitly. Grayson Murphy is mentioned as Maguire's employer. References are made to connections with Morgan banking interests in major corporations, though Butler is careful not to make accusations he cannot prove. He describes the European trip Maguire took to study fascist organising methods. He recounts Maguire's admiring descriptions of Mussolini's approach to governance. He explains the proposed structure: 500,000 veterans, a massive march, forcing Roosevelt into a figurehead role, installing Butler himself as Secretary of General Affairs. The committee is sceptical at first, as any reasonable people would be. The idea of wealthy American business leaders attempting to overthrow the government seems absurd. America is not some unstable Latin American republic prone to coups. This is the United States, with deep democratic traditions and institutional stability. But Butler's credibility is impeccable. He is not known for wild claims or attention-seeking behaviour. His military record is beyond reproach. He has nothing to gain from fabricating this story and much to lose. If he is lying, he is committing perjury before Congress, destroying his reputation and making himself look like a paranoid fool. And his testimony is specific enough to be verified or disproven. He provides dates, locations, names. If this is fabrication, investigators can prove it. If it is true, evidence will exist to corroborate it. So they investigate. Gerald Maguire is called to testify. He arrives looking nervous. which is understandable given that he has just been accused before Congress of planning treason. He denies Butler's allegations, claiming the general misunderstood their conversations. He admits to meeting with Butler multiple times, which establishes that contact occurred as Butler described. But he insists they discussed only conventional political organising, nothing treasonous, nothing resembling a coup attempt. He acknowledges travelling to Europe but says it was for business purposes unrelated to studying fascist governments. He admits connections to Wall Street and major corporations, but frames these as normal business relationships, not conspiracy. His testimony is careful. He does not directly call Butler a liar, which would be risky given Butler's reputation. Instead, he suggests misunderstanding, misinterpretation, conversations taken out of context. But there are problems with Maguire's denials. Investigators confirm details that corroborate Butler's version. They verify Maguire's European trips occurred when and where Butler said they did. They find evidence that Maguire did indeed have conversations about organising veterans for political purposes. They discover that Maguire had access to funding and connections that go beyond what a simple bond salesman would normally possess. Other witnesses are interviewed. Some corroborate parts of Butler's story. Paul Comley French, a journalist who accompanied Butler to one meeting with Maguire, testifies that Maguire did indeed discuss plans for a veterans' march on Washington. This is crucial. Butler is not the only person who heard these things. An independent witness confirms key elements of the story. The committee examines documents, travel records, financial transactions. They dig into Maguire's background, his connections, his activities in the months leading up to Butler's testimony. What emerges is a complicated picture. Clear evidence exists that Maguire approached Butler. Evidence confirms that Maguire had connections to wealthy interests opposed to Roosevelt. Evidence shows discussions about organising veterans took place. Evidence demonstrates Maguire travelled to Europe and studied fascist governments. But direct proof of a concrete operational plan to overthrow the government remains elusive. No written plans surface, no smoking gun documents appear, no major financiers step forward to admit involvement or testify about what they knew. This is where the investigation reaches its limits. Either the conspirators were sophisticated enough to avoid creating evidence, or the conspiracy was more talk than action. Wealthy men entertaining dangerous fantasies without committing to actual treason. In February 1935, the committee releases its report. The language is carefully worded but extremely significant for anyone who reads closely. In the last few weeks of the committee's official life, it received evidence showing that certain persons had made an attempt to establish a fascist organisation in this country. There is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient. Read that carefully. Read it again. The committee confirms that attempts were discussed. They confirm plans existed. They confirm these plans might have been placed in execution if financial backers chose to proceed. This is not a dismissal of Butler's claims as the ravings of a paranoid general. This is not a statement that nothing happened. This is an explicit confirmation that a fascist organisation was planned and could have been executed. Yet the report carefully avoids naming most of the people allegedly involved. References to certain persons and financial backers remain vague. The names of major corporate figures are largely omitted. The full extent of who was involved, how much money was available, how far planning had progressed, all of this remains obscured, and most remarkably, no criminal charges follow. No subpoenas are issued for the major business figures whose names appeared in testimony. No prosecutions occur. The Justice Department takes no action. The investigation simply ends. The committee disbands. The story fades. Why? Several theories exist. Some suggest Roosevelt decided that prosecuting wealthy business leaders during a depression would destabilize the economy further. Others argue that evidence was insufficient for convictions, that without documentation explicitly showing conspiracy to commit treason, criminal charges would fail. Still others believe that powerful interest had enough influence to ensure the matter was quietly buried, that threats were made, pressure was applied, and people with something to lose made sure the investigation went only so far and no further. What is undeniable is that Congress confirmed something serious happened. something that involved planning to establish a fascist organisation, something that might have been executed, and then Congress, the Justice Department, and the Roosevelt administration all decided to let it go. Butler continues speaking publicly about the plot, giving speeches, granting interviews. But media attention dwindles rapidly. He becomes, in many circles, dismissed as someone who perhaps exaggerated a minor incident into a major conspiracy. But the congressional record remains. The testimony is preserved. The committee's conclusion stands, recorded in official documents. Something was planned. Something serious. Something that came closer to happening than most Americans will ever realise. And the people responsible walked free. Chapter 6. The Media Silence. One of the most puzzling and revealing aspects of the business plot is how quickly it disappeared from public consciousness. A decorated general testifies under oath that wealthy interests tried to recruit him for a coup. Congress investigates and confirms that discussions about establishing a fascist organisation took place. Yet within weeks, the story is barely mentioned in major newspapers, and within months, it is almost completely forgotten. This is not how major political scandals normally work. When the Teapot Dome scandal broke in the 1920s, revealing corruption in the Harding administration, newspapers covered it for years. When organised crime figures made headlines, the stories ran for months. When labour disputes turned violent, front-page coverage continued until the situations resolved. But the business plot? After the initial reports when Butler first makes his allegations, coverage drops off dramatically. And the coverage that does exist is often dismissive or sceptical rather than investigative. Initial coverage exists. When Butler first makes his allegations public in November 1934, some newspapers report them. But the tone is revealing. Headlines suggest Butler might be confused or exaggerating. Editorial commentary questions whether a serious plot actually existed. Some papers treat it as a curiosity rather than a potential constitutional crisis. The New York Times, one of the most influential papers in the country, covers the story but treats it with clear skepticism. An early article describes Butler's claims, but focuses more on Maguire's denials than on the details of the alleged conspiracy. The tone implies that a decorated general has perhaps gotten some innocent conversations confused with something more sinister. Other major publications follow similar approaches. The Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, and Los Angeles Times all provide some coverage, but it is measured, cautious, skeptical. Butler's claims are presented as allegations from a controversial figure, rather than credible testimony from a highly decorated officer with no history of fabrication or attention-seeking. Compare this to how other political scandals of the era are covered, especially those involving far less serious allegations. Corruption stories receive extensive ongoing coverage. Political controversies are dissected in detail. Labour disputes and social movements get comprehensive analysis. But a potential coup attempt, that gets a few articles and then silence. When the Congressional Committee releases its findings in February 1935 confirming that planning occurred, you would expect major coverage. Congress has just officially stated that attempts to establish a fascist organisation were discussed and might have been executed. This should be headline news. Instead, the story receives minimal attention. Some papers report the committee's findings briefly. Others do not cover it at all. There is no sustained investigation by major newspapers. No reporters are assigned to dig deeper. No editorial boards demand answers about who was involved and how such planning could occur. The story simply fades. Butler later speaks openly about this media silence. He gives speeches where he explicitly accuses newspapers of suppressing the story. He suggests that powerful interests, the same interests allegedly behind the plot, used their influence to discourage coverage. He points out that many major publications have close ties to the business world through advertising revenue and ownership structures. Stories that implicate wealthy industrialists and bankers might threaten those relationships, and Butler is not wrong about these connections. Major newspapers in the 1930s are owned by wealthy individuals who often have business interests beyond journalism. Advertising revenue comes from corporations who would not appreciate negative coverage. Publishers socialise with the same business leaders who would have been threatened by Roosevelt's policies. There is also the question of what newspapers can prove independently. Butler's testimony is credible, but he is describing private conversations and meetings. Maguire denies the allegations. Other potential conspirators are never definitively identified in public reporting. Without documents showing explicit plans or multiple witnesses confirming every detail, newspapers may have felt the story was too risky to pursue aggressively, but the silence goes beyond simple editorial caution or the challenge of verification. Some reporters who try to follow the story encounter unusual roadblocks. Sources refuse to talk. Documents suddenly become unavailable. Phone calls are not returned. The investigation seems to dead end at every turn in ways that suggest active interference rather than lack of information. One particularly telling incident involves Paul Comley French, the journalist who accompanied Butler to one meeting with Maguire. French provides corroborating testimony to Congress, confirming that Maguire did indeed discuss plans for organising veterans and marching on Washington. French is a respected journalist with a reputation for accuracy, yet his attempts to get the story published in major outlets are repeatedly rejected. Editors tell him the story is too controversial, too difficult to verify, too risky to run without absolute proof. French ends up publishing in smaller, less prominent publications, where his reporting reaches a fraction of the audience it would have reached in major newspapers. This pattern repeats. Journalists who want to cover the story find limited outlets willing to publish. Editors who might normally pursue a scandal of this magnitude decide it is not worth the trouble. Publishers who could demand answers instead remain silent. By mid-1935, less than a year after Butler's initial testimony, the business plot has essentially vanished from mainstream discourse. Butler continues giving speeches to veteran groups and labour organisations. His book, War is a Racket, receives some attention for its critique of the military-industrial complex, but his allegations about the coup attempt are rarely mentioned, and when they are, it is often with an implicit suggestion that he might have exaggerated or misunderstood what happened. This media silence has consequences that echo through history. Because the story disappeared so quickly, entire generations of Americans grow up never hearing about it. History textbooks do not mention it. Teachers do not discuss it. The business plot becomes one of those obscure historical footnotes that only researchers and conspiracy theorists know about. Even today, if you ask random Americans if they have heard of the business plot, the vast majority will say no. If you ask if they know who Smedley Butler was, most will not recognise the name despite his being one of the most decorated Marines in American history. Conspiracy theorists point to this silence as evidence of a cover-up. If the plot was not serious, they argue, why suppress the story? If Butler's allegations were baseless, why not expose him as a fraud through aggressive investigation? The pattern of coverage, initial reports followed by rapid silence, looks suspiciously like coordinated suppression rather than natural editorial decisions. Skeptics counter that newspapers simply moved on to other news in an era of economic crisis and global instability. Roosevelt's New Deal programs provided ongoing stories. International developments in Europe and Asia dominated headlines. The business plot, lacking dramatic developments or clear villains, simply was not compelling enough to sustain coverage. But this explanation struggles to account for the pattern. Newspapers sustained coverage of far less consequential stories. The business plot involved allegations of an attempted coup, congressional confirmation that planning occurred, and implications reaching to the highest levels of American business. This is objectively a massive story. Yet, it disappeared. Whatever the true explanation, one fact is undeniable. A congressional committee confirmed that discussions about overthrowing the government took place, and America collectively chose to forget about it. The media played a central role in that forgetting, whether through deliberate suppression, editorial caution, or simply following the lead of powerful interests who wanted the story buried. And that silence itself tells us something important about power in America. Some stories get told, some stories get amplified, and some stories, particularly those that threaten the interests of the wealthy and powerful, simply disappear. Chapter 7. The Unanswered Questions. Decades after the business plot, with the benefit of historical documents, congressional records and scholarly research, fundamental questions remain unanswered. The basic facts are not in dispute. Maguire approached Butler, conversations occurred, Congress investigated and confirmed planning took place. But the deeper questions, the ones that would actually explain what happened, remain frustratingly open. First, why recruit Butler specifically? On the surface, this makes sense. Butler is famous. Veterans trust him. His military credentials are impeccable. If you want to organise veterans into a political force, Butler is an obvious choice to lead them. But look deeper. By 1933, Butler is increasingly vocal in his criticism of corporate power and military interventions on behalf of business interests. He's giving speeches attacking exactly the kind of people who allegedly wanted to recruit him. He's not subtle about this. He's not quietly, privately grumbling. He is publicly, loudly, declaring that American military operations serve Wall Street rather than American national interests. Would sophisticated conspirators really approach someone so vocally opposed to their worldview? It seems almost incomprehensibly stupid. Unless they believed Butler's criticism was performative rather than genuine, unless they thought Butler was positioning himself for political office and could be bought with the right offer, unless they fundamentally misread his character, or perhaps Butler was not the first choice. Perhaps others were approached and refused before Maguire contacted Butler. Perhaps several generals were tested to see who might be receptive. We know Maguire talked to Butler. We do not know who else might have been contacted. If the conspiracy was real and sophisticated, they would not have put all their hopes on one person. The question becomes even more intriguing when you consider timing. Why approach Butler in 1933, just months after Roosevelt takes office? Why not wait to see if opposition to the New Deal would grow naturally? Why move so quickly to such an extreme measure? The answer might be that the conspirators, if they existed, recognised a window of opportunity. The Depression had created conditions where dramatic action might be possible. Veterans were desperate and angry. Roosevelt's New Deal was controversial and threatening to established interests. Public faith in traditional institutions was shaken. If you're going to attempt a coup, early in a presidency during an economic crisis is strategically the right time. But it still required recruiting someone willing to betray their oath to the Constitution, and they chose someone who would ultimately expose them instead. Second, why did Maguire have access to funding and European contacts? This question cuts to the heart of whether the conspiracy was real or fantasy. Maguire is a bond salesman. He's not a major figure in banking or industry. He does not have personal wealth sufficient to fund an operation of the scale he described to Butler. Yet congressional investigators confirmed Maguire travelled to Europe, confirmed he visited Italy, France and Germany. Confirmed these trips occurred when Butler said they did. International travel in the 1930s during the Depression was expensive. It required substantial funding and clear purpose. Business travellers did not casually spend months touring Europe studying political systems. So where did Maguire get the money for these trips? Who funded them? Who benefited from his research into fascist organising methods? If Maguire was acting alone, if this was just his personal fantasy, the European trips make no sense. Why would a bond salesman spend significant money studying foreign governments? What would be the point? But if Maguire was acting as an agent for wealthier interests, if someone was backing his activities, the trips make perfect sense. You send someone to study how Mussolini organised his black shirts, how Hitler built the SA and SS, how fascist governments structure paramilitary forces and maintain control. You gather information about what works. Then you apply those lessons to the American context. Maguire spoke confidently to Butler about accessing weapons and equipment. He discussed organising hundreds of thousands of veterans. He referenced financial backers with resources. Either he was delusional and none of this was real, or someone was providing him with backing and assurances. The Congressional Committee did not, or could not, trace the money conclusively. But the fact that Maguire had resources beyond his personal means is not disputed. Someone enabled his activities. The question is who? Third, why did Congress confirm planning but pursue no charges? This is perhaps the most frustrating unanswered question. The committee's final report explicitly states that attempts to establish a fascist organisation were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution if financial backers deemed it expedient. That language is not ambiguous. That is not a careful statement designed to neither confirm nor deny. That is an explicit confirmation that serious planning occurred, yet no prosecutions follow. No major figures are even publicly named in the official report. The Justice Department, which could have brought charges based on congressional findings, takes no action. The FBI, which could have investigated further, does not pursue the matter. Why? Several theories exist. Perhaps evidence was insufficient for criminal convictions. Conspiracy to commit treason requires proving intent and concrete actions toward execution. Conversations and planning, however serious, might not meet the legal threshold for prosecution. Maguire denied the allegations. Other potential conspirators were never definitively identified. Without explicit documentation or multiple witnesses, convictions might have been impossible to secure. Perhaps Roosevelt made a calculated political decision. Prosecuting wealthy business leaders during the Depression could have destabilized the economy further. It could have deepened the divide between business and government at a time when cooperation was needed. It might have created martyrs and sympathy for people Roosevelt wanted to marginalize politically. Better, perhaps, to expose the plot just enough to prevent it from proceeding, then let it fade rather than creating a sensational trial. Or perhaps more sinister forces were at work. Perhaps powerful interests exerted pressure. Perhaps threats were made, implicitly or explicitly. Perhaps evidence disappeared. Perhaps witnesses were discouraged from cooperating. Perhaps the investigation was allowed to proceed only so far before being quietly shut down to protect people who could not be touched. We do not know. The reasoning behind the decision not to prosecute was never publicly explained. We have the committee's conclusion, but not their rationale for what did not happen next. Fourth, why were names shielded? Congressional committees usually name names. Investigations into corruption, propaganda, and criminal activity typically identify perpetrators explicitly. When Congress investigates corporate wrongdoing or political corruption, they name the corporations and the individuals involved. The business plot investigation does not follow this pattern. The final report refers to certain persons and financial backers without providing specifics. Butler names Gerald Maguire and references connections to Wall Street interests and major corporations. But the official report omits most names. This could be standard procedure when evidence is circumstantial. Naming someone without proof sufficient for conviction opens the committee to libel concerns and political retaliation. Perhaps the committee felt they had enough evidence to confirm planning occurred, but not enough to name specific backers without risking legal consequences. Or perhaps names were shielded deliberately to protect powerful figures. Perhaps committee members received pressure from people with influence. Perhaps deals were made. Confirm the basic facts, but do not name names, and in return certain political considerations will be arranged. The selective disclosure pattern, confirming a conspiracy existed while obscuring who was responsible, is consistent with protecting the powerful while appearing to take the allegations seriously. Fifth, how serious was the plan? Butler describes detailed conversations about recruiting veterans, marching on Washington, and installing a Secretary of General Affairs to effectively replace Roosevelt. Maguire allegedly discusses logistics, funding, and European precedents. Congressional investigators confirm that planning occurred. But was this ever operationally viable? Could 500,000 veterans actually be recruited? Would they truly march on Washington at Butler's command? Would the military stand aside? Would the public accept it? Would Roosevelt simply resign under pressure? Skeptics argue the plan was absurd from the start. The logistics alone would be overwhelming, the political obstacles insurmountable, the risk of failure catastrophic. Even if some wealthy figures entertained the idea, even if Maguire was genuinely trying to recruit Butler, The conspiracy could never have succeeded. But this analysis assumes rational calculation. The 1930s were not a rational time. Fascist coups were succeeding across Europe in countries with stronger democratic traditions than many people realised. Mussolini took power in Italy, a country with a constitutional monarchy and parliamentary system. Hitler was elected and then dismantled democratic institutions in Germany, a modern industrial nation with sophisticated civil society. If it could happen there, why not America? Veterans were desperate. The economy was devastated. Faith in democratic institutions was weakened. Roosevelt was implementing policies that terrified the wealthy elite. The conditions for authoritarian movements were present, and Butler himself took it seriously. He did not dismiss Maguire as delusional. He did not laugh off the approach. He gathered information, reported it to Congress, and testified under oath that he believed a genuine attempt to overthrow the government was being planned. Butler spent his entire adult life in military service. He understood operational planning. He knew the difference between fantasy and feasible operations, and he concluded this was the latter. Whether the plot would have succeeded if Butler had agreed remains speculation. But the fact that a decorated general believed it was serious enough to expose tells us it was not merely theoretical discussion over drinks at a club. Chapter 8. What Conspiracy Researchers Believe. In the decades since the business plot, researchers operating outside mainstream academic history have developed extensive theories about what really happened. It is important to distinguish these interpretations from established documented facts, but it is equally important to understand why these theories persist and what they suggest about hidden power structures in America. Mainstream academic history generally treats the business plot as an interesting but ultimately minor episode, something that was discussed, something that revealed anxiety among elites about the New Deal, but nothing that ever came close to succeeding. A curiosity rather than a crisis. Conspiracy researchers see something much darker, and their interpretation deserves serious consideration because it explains patterns that mainstream history struggles to account for. Their reading goes something like this. In 1933, a group of powerful industrialists and bankers recognized that Roosevelt's New Deal posed an existential threat to their wealth and power. They looked at fascist governments in Europe and saw a model that preserved corporate interests while crushing labour movements and socialist organising. They decided that America needed similar leadership. These men were not fringe extremists. They were pillars of American business. They controlled banks, corporations, manufacturing. They had access to resources that most people cannot even conceptualize. And they were genuinely terrified that Roosevelt was implementing socialism that would destroy everything they had built. They began planning a coup, not a violent revolution with tanks in the streets. That would be too risky, too likely to backfire. Something more subtle and more brilliant. A massive demonstration of veteran support that would intimidate Roosevelt into accepting a power-sharing arrangement. Present it as saving America rather than overthrowing democracy. Frame it as patriots preventing socialist destruction rather than corporate interest protecting profits. The genius of the plan, if it existed, was its potential legitimacy. If you can get the most decorated general in American history to lead 500,000 veterans to Washington, if they claim to be saving the Constitution from Roosevelt's violations, if they present themselves as patriots rather than traitors, you might actually succeed. The optics would be powerful, the implicit threat would be overwhelming, and Roosevelt might calculate that resistance would cause civil war. They needed a leader credible enough to command veteran loyalty. They chose Butler, not realizing his criticisms of corporate power were genuine rather than political positioning. They approached him carefully, testing his receptiveness through increasingly explicit conversations. Maguire was not the architect. He was a recruiter, someone expendable if things went wrong. The real backers remained hidden, insulated by layers of deniability. If Butler had agreed, they would have revealed themselves, providing the funding and support necessary to execute the operation. If he refused, Maguire would take any fallout while the real conspirators remained untouchable. Butler recognised what was happening and made a calculated decision. He would continue meeting with Maguire, gathering information, learning as much as possible about the conspiracy. Then he would expose it in a way that made execution impossible. His testimony to Congress served multiple purposes. It revealed the plot, making it impossible to proceed. It created a historical record that could not be completely erased. It warned America about the danger of corporate fascism, and it forced the conspirators to retreat and abandon their plans. Congress confirmed the plot was real, but declined to prosecute because naming the conspirators would reveal just how high the corruption reached. Imagine the testimony in a trial. Imagine major corporate executives being questioned under oath about planning to overthrow the government. Imagine the destabilization of business confidence during the Depression. Imagine the political crisis if America's wealthiest families were exposed as attempted coup plotters. Roosevelt made a pragmatic decision. Expose the plot enough to prevent execution, but do not push for prosecutions that would tear the country apart. Let the warning stand. Let the conspirators know they were caught. But do not create the spectacle of a trial that would dominate headlines for years. So the story was buried. Media coverage was suppressed through a combination of ownership interests, advertising pressure, and direct intervention. Butler became marginalised as a controversial figure whose allegations might have been exaggerated, and America forgot how close it came to authoritarianism. This narrative is compelling. It explains the unanswered questions. It accounts for the media silence. It makes sense of why Congress confirmed planning but pursued no charges. It presents Butler as a hero who saved democracy at personal cost. But is it true? Academic historians remain sceptical. They point out the lack of direct evidence linking specific wealthy individuals to explicit coup planning. They note that Maguire's conversations with Butler, while suspicious, do not prove a concrete operational plan with funding committed and timelines established. They observe that organising 500,000 veterans would require logistics that no evidence suggests existed. They propose alternative explanations. Perhaps Maguire was exploring ideas on behalf of business interests, testing whether such a plan was feasible, but never received authorization to actually proceed. Perhaps wealthy elites entertained dangerous fantasies about removing Roosevelt without ever committing to action. Perhaps Butler misinterpreted conversations or Maguire exaggerated his connections to seem more important. The truth likely falls somewhere between complete conspiracy and complete dismissal. Something real was happening. Maguire was not acting in total isolation. Powerful interests opposed to Roosevelt were exploring options, perhaps more seriously than they would later admit. Whether those explorations constituted an operational coup attempt or merely dangerous speculation remains genuinely uncertain. But consider what we know for absolute certain. Butler believed he was being recruited for a coup. He took the threat seriously enough to testify under oath before Congress. Congress investigated and confirmed that attempts to establish a fascist organisation were discussed, were planned, and might have been executed if backers chose to proceed. That confirmation from Congress is not speculation. That is official documented fact in the congressional record. Something serious enough to generate that statement from a congressional committee investigating un-American activities actually happened. The conspiracy researcher interpretation might not be entirely correct in every detail, but it is not baseless paranoia. It is built on documented facts that mainstream history struggles to explain. The European trips, the conversations, the congressional confirmation, the lack of prosecutions, the media silence. Whether you call it a conspiracy or a near miss, whether you believe it was fully operational or merely exploratory, one thing is undeniable. American democracy faced a threat from within, from people with power and resources, and only Butler's refusal prevented us from discovering how serious that threat truly was. Chapter 9. America's Forgotten Warning. No coup occurred. No government fell. Franklin Roosevelt completed his first term and was elected 3 more times, serving longer than any president in American history. The wealthy interests that opposed him adapted, finding other ways to exercise influence through lobbying, propaganda, and political opposition. American democracy survived. So why does the business plot matter almost 90 years later? because a decorated general went to Congress and said, "This was real." And Congress responded, "It was discussed, it was planned, and it might have happened." That exchange represents one of the most remarkable and troubling moments in American history. A moment when the unthinkable was considered by people with power. A moment when the mechanisms of a coup were explored in detail. A moment when America came closer to authoritarianism than most people will ever realise. Butler's warning was not just about a specific plot by specific people. It was about something deeper and more enduring. The danger of concentrated wealth, the threat of corporate power to democratic institutions, how economic crisis creates opportunities for authoritarian solutions, and how quickly democracy can be threatened when enough powerful people decide it no longer serves their interests. In his later speeches and writings, Butler emphasised these systemic themes. He described in detail how business interests shape military policy, how wars are fought to benefit corporations while ordinary soldiers die, how the machinery of government serves wealth rather than citizens. His book, War is a Racket, published in 1935, remains one of the most powerful critiques of militarism ever written by an American military officer. In it, he calculates profits made by corporations during World War I while soldiers died in trenches. He lists companies that made fortunes from military contracts. He proposes radical reforms, including that only soldiers who will actually fight should be allowed to vote on whether to go to war. It is devastating, angry, and written by someone who spent 33 years serving the system he is now exposing. But beyond his anti-war message, Butler's testimony about the business plot carried a different warning that is even more relevant today. Democracy is fragile. It is not guaranteed by documents or traditions. It survives only when people actively defend it. When enough powerful people feel threatened by democratic decisions, they will seek alternatives. And if those alternatives involve military force, the presence of trained personnel and sympathetic officers can make the unthinkable possible. This warning echoes through history with disturbing consistency. Coups have succeeded in other democracies. Business interests have overthrown governments in other countries, often with American support. Chile in 1973, when a democratically elected socialist president was overthrown and replaced with a military dictatorship backed by corporate interests. Iran in 1953, when a democratically elected leader who nationalised oil was removed in a coup orchestrated by American and British intelligence at the behest of oil companies. America's immunity to such forces is not guaranteed by virtue of being America. It is guaranteed only by vigilance, by the willingness of people in positions of power to choose principle over profit, democracy over dictatorship. The business plot failed because Butler exposed it, but consider the counterfactual. What if Butler had agreed? What if he had believed Maguire's arguments about saving America from Roosevelt's socialism? What if he had been more concerned about communist revolution than corporate coup? What if he had led those veterans to Washington? Would the military have fired on American veterans led by the most decorated Marine in history? Would Roosevelt have capitulated rather than risk civil war? Would the American people have accepted it as necessary to save the country from radical change? Would history record it as a legitimate correction to government overreach rather than a coup? We cannot know. History does not reveal its alternative paths. But the fact that we can ask these questions, that a scenario existed where a different decision by one man might have fundamentally altered American government, should be sobering. What we know is that democracy survived, that Butler chose transparency over conspiracy, that Congress confirmed his story even if they took no further action, that America, at least this once, stepped back from the edge. But the edge was there, the possibility existed, and the fact that this moment has been largely forgotten is itself a kind of failure. Collective amnesia about threats to democracy makes those threats more likely to recur. Butler died in June 1940 of cancer at age 58. He died before America entered World War II, before his warnings about war profiteering would be forgotten in patriotic fervour. His testimony about the business plot had already faded from public memory. Today, most Americans have never heard of Smedley Butler. History classes rarely mention him beyond perhaps a footnote in discussions of American imperialism. The business plot is unknown to the vast majority of citizens. It is a curiosity for researchers, a conspiracy theory for some, a forgotten footnote for most. Yet his story deserves to be remembered and taught and discussed, not because it proves some grand conspiracy that controls all aspects of American government, not because it validates paranoid beliefs about shadowy cabals running the world, but because it reveals a profound truth about power. When those who have it feel threatened, they will consider options that seem unthinkable in calmer times. Butler saw such an option being considered. He was offered a role in executing it, and he chose to speak rather than participate. In doing so, he may have prevented one of the greatest crises in American history. The story also reveals how power protects itself. No prosecutions, names shielded, media silence, the story buried. The lesson is clear. You can plan a coup in America and walk free as long as you're wealthy enough and connected enough and the plan never quite reaches execution. That lesson should disturb us. It should make us question. It should make us vigilant. Because the conditions that made the business plot possible, that made powerful people consider overthrowing democracy, those conditions recur throughout history. Economic crisis, political polarization, fear of change, powerful interests threatened by reform. These conditions exist now. They will exist in the future. And each time they exist, someone will consider whether democracy is worth preserving, or whether authoritarian solutions would better serve their interests. Butler's choice to expose rather than execute reminds us that individuals matter, that conscience matters, that when confronted with offers of power in exchange for betraying principles, how we respond shapes history. Final question. So what was the business plot? Was it a genuine coup attempt by America's wealthiest men, a fully operational plan with funding and logistics in place that failed only because Butler exposed it? Was it exploratory conversations that never approached actual implementation? Wealthy men entertaining dangerous fantasies but never seriously committing to action? Or was it something in between, a conspiracy that existed in potential, that could have become real if circumstances aligned, and Butler had agreed, that died because one man chose democracy over dictatorship? The evidence supports all three interpretations to varying degrees. Congressional testimony confirms discussions occurred. Logic suggests operational realities would have made execution difficult. The absence of prosecutions indicates either insufficient evidence or protection of powerful interests. What cannot be debated is this. In 1934, people with resources and connections discussed overthrowing the American government. They identified a military leader to recruit. They explored logistics and funding. They studied European fascist movements for organizational models. And they came close enough to implementation that a congressional committee investigated, confirmed planning occurred, and stated explicitly that execution might have followed if financial backers deemed it expedient. That alone makes the business plot one of the most significant forgotten moments in American history, not because it succeeded, because it was attempted, because it came close enough to make a decorated general risk his reputation to expose it, because Congress confirmed it happened and then America collectively chose to forget, and because it reminds us that democracy's survival is never inevitable. It requires people who choose principle over power. It requires transparency over conspiracy. It requires recognition that some offers, no matter how they are presented, no matter what justifications are provided, must be refused. Smedley Darlington Butler was offered a chance to become the most powerful man in America. He was promised the loyalty of hundreds of thousands of veterans. He was told he would be saving the country from disaster, protecting the Constitution from socialist overreach, preventing communist revolution. He said no. He said no, and then he exposed what was being planned, knowing it would make him enemies among the most powerful people in America, knowing it might cost him his reputation, knowing mainstream media might dismiss him, knowing history might forget him. He said no because he understood something that the conspirators did not, that betraying democracy, even to supposedly save it, is still betrayal, that some principles cannot be compromised regardless of justification. That oath to the Constitution means something more important than personal power or financial reward. And perhaps that simple refusal, that choice to speak rather than participate, is the most important part of the story. Not the conspiracy itself, but the fact that when confronted with it, one man chose not to participate, chose to risk everything to expose it, chose country over personal advancement. History is shaped by such choices more than we realise. Great forces and economic conditions and social movements all matter. But so do individual decisions at critical moments. Butler's decision to expose the business plot rather than lead it represents one of those critical moments. The business plot failed because Butler made the right choice. The question for every generation is whether, when faced with similar choices, when offered power in exchange for principles, when told that betraying democracy is actually saving it, we will do the same. Will we recognise the offer for what it is? Will we have the courage to refuse? Will we risk reputation and comfort to expose conspiracies against democracy? Or will we rationalise, justify, convince ourselves that this time is different, that extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary measures, that the ends justify the means? Butler chose. He chose well. And democracy survived. That is the warning he left us. That is the lesson we forgot. That is the story that needs to be remembered. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this story and find yourself drawn into the mystery, consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes an enormous difference to us. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. Finally, if you enjoy content like this, subscribing really helps us continue bringing you these stories. Now, let's dive in. The fourth test was not the one that failed. They told us it was operator error, a flawed test. Human mistakes compounding in the dead of night until a reactor core tore itself apart and painted the sky with radiation. They gave us names to blame, procedures to question, a neat timeline that ended at exactly 23 minutes past 1 in the morning on April 26, 1986. But my cousin knew something else was happening that night, and he died because of it. Prologue. The letter that didn't make sense. The envelope arrived in June of 1986, 6 weeks after the explosion that the world had already stopped talking about. It was addressed to my aunt and uncle in Kiev, written in the cold, bureaucratic language that Soviet institutions used when they needed to deliver bad news without delivering truth. Sergei Volkov, deceased. Radiation exposure. Service to the state acknowledged. That was it. 3 lines. No location specified. No timeline given. No body to bury. My cousin had worked as a reactor instrumentation technician at Chernobyl Unit 4. He was 28 years old. He knew those systems better than anyone on his shift, and according to the official story, he had died responding to an accident caused by incompetence and design flaws. But 2 weeks before the explosion, Sergei had sent a letter home. I remember watching my aunt read it at the kitchen table, her face creasing with confusion. She passed it to my uncle, who read it twice before setting it down without comment. They didn't understand what Sergei meant, but I did, even then. Or at least, I understood that he was trying to tell them something without saying it directly. The letter mentioned the upcoming test everyone at the plant had been talking about, the turbine run-down experiment, a safety protocol drill that would simulate a power loss and measure how long the turbines could provide electricity while coasting to a stop. But then Sergei wrote something else. Tonight's test isn't for the turbine, that's just what they're saying. My aunt thought he was complaining about bureaucracy. My uncle assumed it was plant politics, but I was a journalist even then, just starting out working for a small paper in Kiev that mostly covered local corruption and housing scandals, and I knew what careful language looked like when someone couldn't speak freely. Sergei was telling them that something else was being tested that night, something they weren't supposed to talk about. After the official letter arrived, I went back and read Sergei's words again, and I started asking questions that no one wanted to answer. Because if the turbine test wasn't the real test, then what actually caused reactor 4 to explode? And if my cousin knew about it beforehand, why didn't anyone stop it? Chapter 1. The test that was never listed. The official explanation was neat, almost too neat. On April 25th, 1986, Chernobyl Unit 4 was scheduled to be shut down for routine maintenance. Engineers decided to use the shutdown as an opportunity to conduct a safety test on the turbine generator. The test would determine whether the turbines, while spinning down after a reactor trip, could generate enough electricity to power essential systems until emergency diesel generators kicked in. It was a reasonable test, a necessary test, and according to every official report, it was the test that went catastrophically wrong when operators disabled safety systems, reduced reactor power too far, and triggered a runaway chain reaction. But as I began digging into the details, I found references to something else. The first hint came from an engineer named Victor, who had worked at Chernobyl Unit 3. He'd been on duty the night of the explosion, just one building over from the catastrophe. I tracked him down to a small apartment in Minsk, where he was living on a medical pension, his health destroyed by radiation exposure during the cleanup. He didn't want to talk at first. Most people didn't. The fear lingered long after the Soviet Union stopped actively threatening people into silence. But eventually, over tea that he poured with shaking hands, Victor told me what he remembered. "Everyone knows about the turbine test," he said. "That's in all the reports. That's what they tell the IAEA inspectors. But there were other things happening that night. Other programs running." "What kind of programs?" Victor looked at his hands. "We called it Program K. I don't know what the K stood for. We weren't supposed to know. It was marked in the logs but never explained. Just Program K, scheduled for the same window as the turbine test." "What was it testing?" "I don't know. That's the truth. But I know it involved the fuel, the reactor core configuration, and I know that military oversight was much higher than usual in the weeks before the shutdown." He leaned forward, his voice dropping even though we were alone. "The turbine test was real, but it was also cover. Something else was being tested that night, and when it failed, they needed a public story that didn't involve whatever Program K actually was. I found 3 other engineers who confirmed similar suspicions. None of them knew details, none of them had documentation, but all of them remembered the strange atmosphere in the weeks before the explosion, the unusual security, the classified meetings, the sense that something bigger than routine testing was happening. And all of them remembered that the logs referenced experiments that never appeared in any official report. The turbine test failed. That much was true, but I became convinced it failed because something else failed first, something they could never admit. Chapter 2. Why? Chernobyl was chosen. Chernobyl was not a random location. It sat in northern Ukraine, near the Belarusian border, surrounded by forests and small villages that had existed for centuries. It was isolated but accessible, massive but controllable, and it was entirely under state control, with no foreign oversight and minimal public scrutiny. It was, in other words, the perfect place to conduct experiments that couldn't be allowed to fail publicly. The plant had 4 operational reactors, with 2 more under construction. It generated enormous amounts of electricity for Ukraine and Belarus. But it also served other purposes that were never advertised to the people living in Pripyat or the surrounding towns. I found a set of procurement records from 1984 and 1985, buried in archives that had been partially declassified. They showed unusual materials being delivered to Chernobyl, specialised fuel rod configurations, monitoring equipment that exceeded standard operational needs, and most tellingly, equipment ordered by military departments rather than civilian energy ministries. Why would the military be ordering equipment for a civilian power plant? I spoke with a retired physicist named Anatoly, who had worked at a different Soviet nuclear facility. He'd never been to Chernobyl, but he understood the system. He understood how these plants operated within the broader structure of Soviet nuclear research. Chernobyl wasn't just generating power, he told me. All the RBMK reactors had dual purposes. Officially, they made electricity. Unofficially, they were laboratories. They could test fuel behaviours, neutron flux patterns, material degradation under extreme conditions, things you couldn't easily replicate in smaller research reactors. Why Reactor 4 specifically? Anatoly shrugged. Newer, better instrumentation, and far enough from the older units that if something went wrong, you could potentially contain it to one building, though obviously that didn't work out. He paused, considering his next words carefully. There were always rumours about military applications. Not weapons, exactly. The Soviets had plenty of weapons reactors, but experimental programs, testing things that might have defence implications, and Chernobyl's location, near military facilities, near restricted zones. It made sense. You could test something there and, if it succeeded, integrate it into military infrastructure. If it failed... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't. Need to. If it failed, you could blame operators, blame design flaws, blame anything except the real purpose of the test. Chapter 3. The military was there before the explosion. Official timelines placed the explosion at 1:23 and 40 seconds in the morning on April 26th. The first responders, according to these same timelines, arrived shortly after. Firefighters from Pripyat, emergency crews from the plant, military units called in as the scale of the disaster became clear. But people who were there remember it differently. I found a former civil defence coordinator named Mikhail, who had been stationed near Chernobyl in 1986. He'd been involved in evacuation planning, though he hadn't been on duty the night of the explosion. But he knew people who had been, and he'd seen the transport logs. Military vehicles were on site before dawn, he told me. Not after the explosion. Before. Specialised units, chemical troops, radiation monitoring teams. They were mobilised hours before any official alarm went out. How is that possible? Mikhail gave me a long look. You tell me. Either they had advance warning that something was going to happen, or they were already there for another reason. I pressed him for documentation, but he said most of the logs from that night had been destroyed or reclassified. What he remembered, though, was the timing. Units moving into position in the early hours of April 26th. Roadblocks established before civilians knew anything was wrong. Restricted zones set up around the plant before the word evacuation was ever spoken. Another witness, a truck driver named Oleg who had been making deliveries to the plant that week, described seeing armed personnel near Reactor 4 in the days before the explosion. Not normal security, military police. Officers who checked credentials multiple times and restricted movement in ways that seemed excessive for a routine shutdown. I met Oleg at a truck stop outside Kyiv, a grey place that smelled of diesel fuel and old coffee. He was hesitant to talk, kept looking over his shoulder even though the Soviet Union had been gone for years. Some fears don't fade with political systems. It felt like something was being protected, Oleg said, his voice low. Or hidden. I couldn't tell which. But I've made deliveries to military facilities. I know what that kind of security looks like, and in the 3 days before the explosion, Chernobyl had that same feeling. Like the plant wasn't just a power station anymore, like it had become something else. He described checkpoints that hadn't existed the previous week, credentials being verified against lists that guards carried in sealed envelopes, entire sections of the facility blocked off with new barriers and warning signs. On April 24th, I delivered equipment to the main administrative building. While I was waiting for signatures, I saw officers going in and out of a conference room, high-ranking, the kind who don't normally show up for turbine tests, and they looked worried. Not the kind of worried you get before a routine procedure, the kind of worried you get when something's already gone wrong and you're trying to figure out how to fix it. Oleg pulled out a delivery manifest from 1986, faded and creased from years of being carried in his wallet. He'd kept it all this time, he said, because it was the only proof he had that he'd been there. The manifest showed deliveries on April 23rd, 24th and 25th, standard industrial equipment for the first 2 days. But the April 25th delivery was marked differently. Special handling, military receiving, a notation in the corner that read K program materials. I asked what K program meant, Oleg said. The receiving officer told me to forget I'd seen it, not in a threatening way, in a tired way, like he was exhausted from carrying secrets. The pieces suggested a disturbing possibility. If military units were on site before the explosion, they either knew something catastrophic was about to happen, or they were there as part of whatever Program K actually involved. Either way, the official narrative of a sudden, unexpected accident didn't match the reality, and the presence of military personnel days before the disaster suggested planning, preparation, the kind of infrastructure you build around an experiment, not an accident. Chapter 4. The reactor did not explode once. The official story describes a single catastrophic event. At 1:23 and 40 seconds on the morning of April 26th, a massive power surge caused Reactor 4's core to rupture. The explosion destroyed the reactor building, ejected radioactive material into the atmosphere, and started fires that burned for days. One explosion, one moment of failure. But seismic data tells a different story. I obtained access to seismographic records from monitoring stations in Ukraine and Belarus. These stations continuously recorded ground vibrations, used primarily for detecting earthquakes, but sensitive enough to pick up large industrial events. The data showed 2 distinct energy releases that morning. The first occurred around midnight. It registered as a moderate disturbance, consistent with an internal structural failure. Not large enough to destroy a building, but significant enough to indicate something had gone seriously wrong inside the reactor. The second occurred at 1:23, exactly when the official timeline placed the explosion. This was the massive event that everyone knew about, the one that destroyed the building and scattered radioactive debris across the surrounding area. But if there were 2 events, what happened during the hours between them? I found a former plant security officer named Leonid, who had been on duty that night. He'd been stationed at the perimeter, far enough from Reactor 4 to survive, but close enough to see what happened. There was a sound around midnight, he remembered, deep, like something heavy breaking inside a building. And then there was confusion, people running, radio chatter, but no alarm, no evacuation order, just chaos that was being contained. What do you think happened? Leonid shook his head. I think something failed inside the reactor, something that exposed the core. And I think they spent the next hour trying to figure out what to do about it before everything went completely to hell. The implication was staggering. If the reactor core had been compromised hours before the main explosion, then dozens of workers had been exposed to lethal radiation levels while trying to manage a situation that was already beyond saving. And if that was true, then the official timeline wasn't just incomplete. It was a deliberate reconstruction designed to hide what actually happened. Chapter 5. The men sent in first. In the official narrative, the first responders were firefighters and emergency crews who arrived after the explosion. Brave men who fought the fires and contained the immediate crisis, many of whom died from acute radiation syndrome in the days and weeks that followed. But there were others, men who were sent into high radiation zones before the main explosion, men whose names don't appear in the official lists of first responders. I learned about them from a nurse named Irina, who had worked at the medical facility in Pripyat. In the hours and days after the disaster, she treated hundreds of people for radiation exposure. She kept notes, unofficial records of who came through and what their symptoms were. There were workers who came in before the firefighters, she told me, maintenance staff, technicians. Their exposure levels were enormous. far higher than what they should have been if they'd only been exposed after the main explosion. How is that possible? It's not, Irina said flatly, unless they were already inside contaminated areas before the explosion happened. She showed me her notes, faded and water-stained but still legible. Names, times, symptoms, estimated exposure levels. Several workers had been brought in around 2 a.m, just after the main explosion, but their radiation doses suggested they'd been exposed for hours. One entry stood out. Pyotr Markov, instrumentation technician, brought in at 0 to 15 hours, exposure estimated at 600 Röntgen minimum, complained of nausea, confusion, severe headache, kept saying we were just supposed to observe. 600 Röntgen was a lethal dose, and Pyotr's symptoms suggested he'd been exposed long before 2 a.m. We were just supposed to observe. What had he been sent to observe? I tried to find Pyotr Markov, but he died 3 days after the explosion. Acute radiation syndrome. His death was recorded, but his work assignments that night were not. Irina had more to tell me, though. After our first meeting, she called me back 3 days later. She'd been thinking about Pyotr, she said, remembering more details. He wasn't alone when they brought him in, she told me. There were 4 others, all instrumentation technicians, all with exposure levels that didn't match the timeline, and they all kept asking the same questions. Where's the containment team? Why didn't the alarms work earlier? How long had the core been exposed? She paused, her voice shaking slightly. One of them, I can't remember his name, he grabbed my arm while I was trying to get an IV started. He was already delirious, his skin was red and blistering, but he looked at me and said, "They sent us down at midnight. We measured the radiation levels. We reported them, and they sent us back down anyway." "Did you report this?" Irina laughed bitterly. "To who? The same people who'd sent them down there in the first place? The same officials who were already constructing the narrative about operator error? I was a nurse. I treated patients. I documented what I saw, but I knew better than to ask questions that no one wanted answered." The pattern repeated. Multiple workers with exposure levels that didn't match the official timeline. Multiple workers who'd apparently been in high radiation areas before they should have been. But what haunted me most was what Irina said next. They knew they were dying. All of them. You could see it in their eyes. And what made it worse was that they knew they'd been sent in there deliberately. They'd been ordered to witness something, to gather data about something, and it had killed them. And they understood, even in their delirium, that no one would ever acknowledge what they'd been sent to do. They'd been sent into the reactor building for a reason, not to fix anything, to witness something, and whatever they saw killed them. Chapter 6. The blue light was not normal. In the testimonies from survivors, a detail appears repeatedly. A strange blue-white light that workers described seeing near the reactor core in the hours before and after the explosion. Officially, this is explained as Cherenkov radiation. When charged particles move through a medium faster than light travels in that medium, they emit a characteristic blue glow. It's a well-understood phenomenon, common in nuclear reactors. But the descriptions from Chernobyl didn't quite match typical Cherenkov radiation. Workers described the light as pulsing, intensifying and fading in waves. Some reported feeling electromagnetic interference, watches stopping, radio equipment malfunctioning. One worker, a crane operator named Dmitry, described seeing the light through a window in the reactor hall moments before the main explosion. I found Dmitry living in a small apartment in Belarus, still on medical monitoring decades after the disaster. His hands shook constantly. Neurological damage, the medical report said, though whether from radiation or trauma was impossible to determine. It wasn't steady, he told me, his voice still haunted decades later. It was like something breathing, getting brighter, then dimmer, then brighter again. And there was a sound, high-pitched, made your teeth hurt. He got up and walked to the window, staring out at nothing. I was operating the crane in Reactor 3 that night. We had a clear view across to Reactor 4 through the windows in the upper levels. Around midnight, maybe a little after, I saw the light start. At first I thought it was just normal operation. Blue glow, that's not unusual. But then it started pulsing, like a heartbeat, and the intensity kept increasing. Dimitri's hands clenched on the windowsill. My watch stopped. Just stopped. The crane control started acting strange, responding slowly, not quite right. And then I heard people shouting over the radio, panicked voices, someone yelling about neutron flux, someone else demanding to know why the control rods weren't responding properly. What did you do? I watched. That's all I could do. The light kept getting brighter. It was beautiful in a terrible way, like watching something that shouldn't exist. And then, maybe an hour later, the whole building exploded. But the light, that pulsing light, that had been happening long before the explosion. These descriptions suggested something beyond normal reactor behaviour. I consulted with a nuclear physicist named Elena, who specialised in reactor dynamics. I described what witnesses had reported, without mentioning Chernobyl specifically. Just the symptoms, the pulsing light, the electromagnetic effects. That sounds like uncontrolled neutron bursts, she said immediately. Fluctuating criticality. The reactor is going in and out of critical states rapidly. It's extremely dangerous and shouldn't happen in a properly designed system. What would cause it? Elena thought for a moment. Fuel configuration problems. If the fuel assembly is damaged or arranged in ways it's not supposed to be, or if you're running experiments with unusual fuel types or geometries, anything that disrupts the normal neutron flux patterns. Would military applications involve unusual fuel configurations? Eleanor's expression closed down. I wouldn't know about that. But her reaction told me everything I needed to know. The blue light wasn't just Cherenkov radiation. It was evidence of a reactor core behaving in ways it was never supposed to behave. Ways that suggested someone had deliberately altered its configuration to test something new. Something that pulsed like a heartbeat before it died. Chapter 7. Why the truth could never be admitted. By this point in my investigation, I'd accumulated enough evidence to write a story. Not proof, exactly, but a compelling argument that something else had been tested at Chernobyl that night. Something beyond a turbine safety drill. But I also understood why that story could never be officially acknowledged. Admitting that experimental testing caused the disaster would mean admitting violations of international treaties. The Soviet Union had signed agreements limiting certain types of nuclear research. Admitting military involvement would raise questions about weapon development, treaty compliance, and oversight failures at the highest levels of government. It would mean admitting that party officials had prioritized experimental programs over the safety of their own citizens. It would mean acknowledging that the entire Soviet nuclear infrastructure was built on secrecy so deep that even catastrophic failures could be rewritten. The truth would collapse trust not just in Chernobyl, but in every nuclear facility in the Soviet Union. It would invite international investigations that the state couldn't control. It would expose vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. So instead they chose a simpler narrative. Operator error, flawed reactor design, human mistakes compounding in the night. Blame the technicians who disabled safety systems. Blame the engineers who designed the RBMK reactor. Blame anyone and everyone except the program that turned a power plant into a laboratory. It was a calculated trade. A few scapegoats in exchange for protecting the broader system. And it worked. The world accepted the official story. Chernobyl became a cautionary tale about the dangers of human error and inadequate safety culture. The liquidators cleaned up the mess. The sarcophagus sealed the reactor. Life went on. But the real story stayed buried. Buried with men like my cousin, who died because someone needed eyes inside the core. Chapter 8. The Missing Records. If Program K existed, there should have been records, documentation, reports. The Soviet system was nothing if not bureaucratic. Every test, every experiment, every protocol required paperwork. But when I tried to find records from April 25th and 26th, 1986, I found holes. Not everything was missing. The turbine test documentation existed. Shift logs from other reactors survived. Maintenance schedules, security reports, even cafeteria inventories from that week were archived. But specific records from Reactor 4 during the critical hours were gone. Reactor monitoring data from midnight to 2 in the morning. Missing. Personnel movement logs showing who was where during the test. Missing. Internal communications between the control room and plant management. Missing. I spoke with an archivist named Svetlana who had worked in the records department at Chernobyl before the explosion. She'd been evacuated with everyone else, but she'd helped compile documentation in the months afterward. We met in a cafe in Kiev, the kind of anonymous place where conversations disappeared into background noise. Svetlana was in her 60s now, worn down by decades of carrying knowledge she couldn't share. Some things were lost in the evacuation, she acknowledged, but not everything. Some files were removed deliberately, before the investigation started, before anyone from Moscow arrived to take control of the scene. Who removed them? Svetlana hesitated, stirring her tea with hands that had developed a slight tremor. People in uniforms, not plant security, military. They came through in the first few days and took boxes of documents. We were told it was for the investigation, but those files never appeared in any official report. She leaned forward, her voice dropping. I kept an inventory, part of my job. I knew what was in those boxes because I'd filed most of it myself. Reactor monitoring logs, internal communications between control room staff and plant management, personnel assignment sheets showing who was working where and when, technical specifications for fuel assemblies, all dated April 25th and 26th. Do you still have the inventory? I destroyed it in 1992. I was warned that keeping it would be dangerous, not in a dramatic way. Just a quiet suggestion from someone who knew what happened to people who asked too many questions. Svetlana looked out the window at the street, watching people pass by in their ordinary lives. But I remember the specific files that disappeared, and I remember that most of them had K-program designations in the classification codes. I didn't know what it meant at the time, but later, when I heard rumours about experimental testing, I understood. I tried to access military archives, but those requests were denied. Classified, they said. National security, they said. The denials came in official letters with impressive letterhead and bureaucratic language that said everything and nothing. After the third denial, I received a phone call. No introduction, just a voice explaining that continuing to request these specific files would be counterproductive to my career and potentially my personal safety. It wasn't a direct threat. Nothing I could report to authorities. Just a clear message that some doors were meant to stay closed. Even decades later, with the Soviet Union gone and archives supposedly opening, certain files remained sealed. I submitted Freedom of Information requests through the new Russian system. I contacted Ukrainian officials. I reached out to international organisations that had investigated Chernobyl. Some requests were ignored, some were denied with vague justifications. A few were acknowledged but never fulfilled, trapped in bureaucratic limbo that felt deliberately designed to outlast anyone's patience. The absence of evidence became its own kind of evidence. Someone had decided what the world should know about Chernobyl, and they'd made sure everything else disappeared. The question that haunted me wasn't just what was in those missing files. It was who had the authority to make them disappear across two different political systems, across decades, across the collapse of an entire empire. Whatever Program K was, it was important enough to protect long after the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Chapter 9. The Last Proof. I'd been investigating for 3 years when I got the call. A retired physicist named Grigory wanted to meet. He'd heard about my research through mutual contacts and had something to show me. He wouldn't say what it was over the phone, just that I should come to his dacha outside Moscow if I wanted to understand what really happened. I went. Grigory was in his 70s, thin and tired, living alone in a small house surrounded by birch trees. The dacha was modest, the kind of place Soviet professionals retired to when their usefulness to the state had expired. Inside, it smelled of old books and wood smoke. He made tea and we talked about irrelevant things for an hour, both of us knowing that he was deciding whether to trust me. We discussed the weather, the state of Russian politics, the price of bread. Normal conversation that felt like a test. Finally, he set down his teacup and looked at me directly. "You've been asking questions about Program K for 3 years," he said. It wasn't a question. "You've spoken to engineers, archivists, witnesses. You've had requests denied. You've been warned to stop, but you're still asking." I didn't confirm or deny. I waited. Grigory stood and went to a locked drawer in an old desk. He pulled out a key from a chain around his neck, unlocked it, and retrieved a single sheet of paper sealed in a plastic sleeve. "This is a copy," he said. "The original is somewhere I'll never tell you, but I've kept this for 30 years, waiting for someone who might actually care about the truth." He handed it to me with hands that shook slightly. It was a memo, dated April 27th, 1986, marked classified. Addressed to a department I didn't recognise, some combination of letters and numbers that suggested military scientific coordination. The text was brief. Reactor behaviour exceeded modelled parameters under K conditions. Secondary containment failure occurred at 0012 hours. Primary failure at 0123. Event must be attributed to operational failure. All K program references to be removed from official documentation. Military oversight logs to be sealed under national security classification. I read it 3 times, my hand starting to shake just like Grigory's. 0012 hours, midnight and 12 minutes, exactly when witnesses reported the first disturbance, the seismic data's first event, the moment when something inside Reactor 4 began to fail. And there it was, in official documentation, acknowledging that the event had to be attributed to operational failure. Not that it was operational failure, that it must be attributed to it. "What are K conditions?" I asked. Grigory sat back down heavily, suddenly looking older than his years. "I don't know the details. I was a physicist at a different facility, and we had our own classified programs, but I know it involved experimental fuel configurations, testing reactor behaviour under scenarios that weren't part of normal operations. The goal was to understand core dynamics under extreme conditions, push the boundaries of what we thought was possible. For what purpose? Officially? Safety research? Understanding reactor limits so we could design better systems, operate them more efficiently, extract more power. But the military was involved, which meant it was never just about civilian applications." Grigory stood and walked to the window, looking out at the birch trees. "You have to understand the context. This was 1986. The Cold War wasn't over. The Americans had programs we didn't fully understand. We had programs they didn't know about. Nuclear technology was power, both literally and politically. Every major power was pushing boundaries, testing limits, trying to gain advantages that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. So what was really being tested that night? I don't know, and I'm not sure anyone still alive does. But I know that whatever it was, it failed spectacularly. And I know that the decision to cover it up came from the highest levels. This memo wasn't written by plant management. The language, the authority to order document destruction, the classification level, this came from Moscow, from people who understood that admitting the truth would be more damaging than the disaster itself. Why are you giving this to me? Grigory looked at me with tired eyes that had seen too much. Because people died for something they didn't understand. Because the world deserves to know that Chernobyl wasn't just an accident. Because I'm old enough now that I don't care what happens to me. And because someone needs to remember that the official story is a construction, not the truth. He paused. But I'm also giving this to you with no illusions. You won't be able to publish it. Not in any meaningful way. The systems that protected this secret 30 years ago are still in place. They've changed names, changed organisational structures, but the imperative to keep certain knowledge buried that survives political transitions. I left with the copy of the memo tucked in my jacket, my mind racing. It wasn't enough to prove everything, but it was enough to prove that something had been hidden. Something they'd decided to call operational failure. Something that exceeded modelled parameters and required a coordinated cover-up spanning military and civilian institutions. As I drove back to Moscow, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to be followed. The paranoia felt justified. I'd just been given documentation that proved a government conspiracy to falsify the cause of one of history's worst nuclear disasters. The question wasn't whether the secret was real. The question was whether I would live long enough to figure out what to do with it. Chapter 10. What Really Melted. Looking back through all the evidence, all the testimonies, all the holes in the official story, I came to understand what happened at Chernobyl. Reactor 4 didn't just fail, it revealed a flaw in Soviet nuclear experimentation. Someone, somewhere in the military scientific complex, decided to use a routine shutdown as an opportunity to test something. Maybe it was fuel behaviour under unusual conditions. Maybe it was reactor control systems under stress. Maybe it was something I still don't fully understand. They called it Program K. They scheduled it for the same night as the turbine test, using the public experiment as cover for the secret one. And sometime around midnight on April 26th, something went wrong. The reactor core behaved in ways they didn't predict. Neutron flux became unstable. The fuel configuration created feedback loops that the control systems couldn't manage. The reactor started destroying itself from the inside. They tried to control it. They sent workers in to observe and report. They scrambled to find a solution before the situation became impossible to contain. But nuclear physics doesn't care about political necessity. The core continued its death spiral, and at 1:23 in the morning, the containment failed completely. The building exploded. The radioactive plume spread across Europe, and in the aftermath, someone made a decision. The truth about Program K would never be admitted. The experimental nature of the test would be classified. The military involvement would be denied. The missing hours between midnight and the explosion would be erased from official records. Instead, they would blame operators. They would blame design flaws. They would create a narrative of human error and inadequate safety culture. It was cleaner that way, simpler, less dangerous to the state. My cousin Sergei didn't die responding to an accident. He died because someone needed eyes inside the core when Program K started failing. He was sent in to witness an experiment escaping containment, and he died knowing that whatever he was seeing would never be acknowledged. Epilogue: the concrete lid. They sealed Reactor 4 under a massive concrete sarcophagus. Thousands of workers, many of whom would later die from radiation exposure, entombed the destroyed reactor in cement and steel. The official story sealed responsibility just as effectively. I tried to publish what I'd learned. I wrote a comprehensive article laying out all the evidence, all the inconsistencies, all the questions that official reports couldn't answer. My newspaper refused to run it. Too controversial, they said. Too speculative. Too dangerous. The editor, a man I'd worked with for 8 years, took me aside and spoke quietly. "I believe you," he said. "I believe something was covered up, but this paper can't survive publishing this story. We'll lose access to government sources, advertising will dry up, and honestly I'm worried about what might happen to you if we run it." He wasn't being dramatic. He was being practical, and he was probably right. I tried other outlets. Same response. Some editors were sympathetic but cautious. Others were hostile, accusing me of disrespecting the memory of those who died, of spreading conspiracy theories, of undermining public trust in nuclear safety when the world needed nuclear power. One editor, a woman who'd covered Chernobyl extensively in the immediate aftermath, told me something that stuck with me. "Even if you're right," she said, "what do you think will happen? The Soviet Union is gone. The people who made these decisions are dead or beyond accountability. The reactor is sealed. Publishing this won't change anything except make you unemployable and possibly unsafe. Is the truth worth your career, your safety, your life?" I didn't have a good answer. None of them would publish the story. The paper I worked for was eventually shut down, though officially for unrelated financial reasons. Declining readership, they said. Market forces. The usual justifications for making inconvenient journalism disappear. I moved to a smaller publication, then a smaller one still. Each transition meant less resources, less reach, less ability to investigate anything meaningfully. Eventually I stopped being a journalist in any meaningful sense, and started being someone who wrote press releases and covered city council meetings. The investigation haunted me. I'd spent 3 years chasing truth, accumulating evidence, talking to witnesses who trusted me with their stories, and in the end, I couldn't do anything with it. I kept all my notes, all my interviews, all the documentation I'd gathered, locked in a safe in my apartment waiting for... what? I didn't know. Some future moment when the truth might matter, when someone might listen. Years passed. The Soviet Union collapsed, archives opened, researchers gained access to previously classified materials, but the key files about Program K never appeared. I watched as historians wrote books about Chernobyl. Some were excellent, meticulously researched, deeply compassionate about the human cost. But they all worked within the framework of the official narrative. Operator error, design flaws, safety culture failures. All true in their way, but not the whole truth. Occasionally, someone would stumble across a detail that hinted at something deeper, a reference to unexplained military presence, a gap in the timeline, missing documentation. But without the broader context, without the accumulated evidence I'd gathered, these details remained isolated curiosities rather than pieces of a larger pattern. Whatever documentation existed about Program K remains locked away, classified under national security protocols that survived the transition from Soviet to Russian control. The institutional imperative to protect certain secrets transcends political systems. I still have Grigory's memo, hidden where no one will find it unless I choose to reveal it. I still have my notes, my interviews, my timeline of evidence. But I've accepted that the truth about Chernobyl will likely die with my generation. The men who knew what really happened are gone. Grigory died 6 years after giving me that memo. Victor, the engineer from Unit 3, died from cancer related to his radiation exposure. Irina, the nurse, passed away without ever seeing her testimony acknowledged. One by one, the witnesses are disappearing. The documents that would prove the conspiracy are destroyed or sealed beyond reach. The institutional memory has been rewritten so many times that even participants in the event probably believe the official version now. Repetition creates reality, and the official story has been repeated for nearly 40 years. My cousin Sergei is buried in a cemetery outside Kiev, his grave marked with a simple stone that doesn't mention how he died or why. Sometimes I visit and try to explain why I couldn't tell his story properly, why the truth he died knowing remains classified. I imagine he would understand. He worked in a system where some knowledge was too dangerous to speak aloud, where certain experiments couldn't be acknowledged, where individual lives mattered less than protecting institutional secrets. Chernobyl became a symbol, a warning about the dangers of nuclear power, about human fallibility, about the costs of inadequate safety culture, all of which is true in its way. But it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is that Chernobyl wasn't just the cost of human error. It was the cost of learning something they were never supposed to learn. It was the moment an experiment escaped containment, and someone decided that the world could never know what was really being tested. My cousin Sergei knew, and it got him killed. 30-some years later, I finally understand what he was trying to tell us in that last letter home. Tonight's test isn't for the turbine. That's just what they're saying. He was right, and no one will ever officially admit it. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I should have tried harder. Published the story anyway, consequences be damned. Gone to international press, to foreign journalists who might have been beyond the reach of Russian institutional pressure. But I also know how these stories end for people who push too hard against secrets that powerful institutions want kept. Some truths are too dangerous to tell, some lies are too useful to abandon, and some disasters are too complex to explain honestly, without admitting things that no government wants to admit. The concrete sarcophagus sealed Reactor 4, the official story sealed responsibility, and the real truth remains buried under layers of classification, destroyed documentation, and calculated silence. Maybe someday, long after everyone involved is dead, the full story will emerge. Maybe some future historian will find the missing pieces and reconstruct what actually happened that night. Or maybe Program K will remain classified forever, another secret carried to the grave by men who knew that some knowledge is too dangerous to survive them. All I know is this: my cousin didn't die in an accident. He died because someone needed eyes inside the core. And the reactor didn't just fail, it revealed something they were never supposed to learn. End.